Hello, this is a guy who likes fanfiction and is too lazy to read, so here is Protector of the Fairies in audio form. Check the description for the links to the author. Protector of the Fairies. The ceasefire. Waiting patiently, Ichigo continued to keep his eyes focused on the main path of darkness in the nearby area. Zeref would be here soon and he wasn't planning to take any chances. The remade larger blade of his Zanpakuto in one hand with his other held up a densely packed ball of energy, courtesy of a Kata spell that probably wasn't intended to be used as a glorified light source. Right now though he didn't care much for that. It served to illuminate the area and keep the darkness further away from him, limiting where Zeref could arrive from. It was also why he had to make it look like this wasn't a sign of aggression. He had gotten Zeref's attention, he was sure, but doing so required cleaving through his army until they sent for help. It hadn't been a pleasant experience. It reminded him of his rampage through the Hollow Army, only this time every person he had killed had been another human. And he hated it how he probably cared about them more than Zeref, their supposed emperor, did. He hoped he could convince him to this ceasefire too. Fighting him was not a task he wanted to undertake currently. It would take too much time, especially with Zeref's immortality and endless legions of demons, and he had so little time left as it stood. This had to be ended peacefully. It was why he had Mavis and Mest as far back as possible, within range for him to reach far before Zeref could, but far enough away to make it look like he didn't intend to brag about having time traveled. He wouldn't put it past Zeref to take one look at her, realize she's in her living body, and then to just act based on his anger. Zeref really was making him wait quite a while though. It had already been an hour since the army had stopped fighting back and merely run. He hadn't bothered pursuing them, his point made, but now he wasn't sure if Zeref knew he was here and was keeping him waiting out of spite or was merely not coming. He'd give the Dark Mage another 30 minutes if necessary, but beyond that, he'd have to just resign himself to the fact the war would continue and interfere with his attempts to stop Mimi Heiji. It appeared though that his prayers were finally being answered when the shadows ahead of him began to move, stretching upwards as a figure took shape once more. And for a brief moment, he wasn't sure who he was looking at. Logically he knew this was Zeref. He recognized the face, and the look of disgust being directed at him. Whenever they met, that one was one of the few faces he saw from Zeref, the others tending to consist of hate, anger, or smugness. There could be no doubt currently who that face belonged to. What puzzled him though was that arm that the man before him lacked on his right side. He remembered his time of fighting Zeref. The most demoralizing thing was that nothing he did ever stuck. The most he had ever harmed Zeref permanently was emotionally, clawing away copies of memories and revealing he had gotten a good look into the man's past. But that only ever made Zeref angry. It lingered only in Zeref's view of him, and didn't change the fact that he couldn't kill him yet. How many times had he used the blades of his pseudo-bankai to cut through Zeref's flesh? How many times had he severed the Dark Mage's head from his body or cut him into pieces from a barrage of slashes too far for Zeref to follow? So many times he had landed blows that should have killed Zeref, and after every one he would look back and find Zeref in perfect health. There had never been a wound that remained on his body. This sight before him spat on all of that. Like this, Zeref didn't look invincible. He didn't look indestructible. It was only a piece of him, everything of his right arm up to the shoulder, but because of it all he saw was a man in pain. A man weakened. A man wounded. A man killable. Are you done staring? Zeref demanded, not bothering to hide any of his loathing. Ichigo shrugged briefly, his eyes barely glancing away from the stump. Almost. That looks like it hurts. A lot. Mind telling me who did that? And how preferable? I'd love to know which of the many people you've pissed off finally found a way to actual maim you. Oh good, you did come here to fight. Well then dash. That's not why I'm here, Ichigo quickly clarified, being forced to take his focus away from the stump as the shadows around Zeref began to move. His words barely made it in time to give Zeref a reason to pause, the half-formed bodies pausing mid-construction. I'm merely here to talk. After killing a good chunk of my men here. Don't pretend that you care for them, Ichigo countered. He had glanced round at these people many times since he had been here, and yet Zeref hadn't even taken one look since he arrived. These people are your pawns. I've seen inside your head, and I can tell you view these people the same way you do with your demons. Tools to use, merely equipped with different weapons and lead by a different mask. Or am I wrong? No, but replacing humans is so much harder than demons, Ziraf replied uncaringly. It took a long time to make Alvarez's army into a creditable threat. Losses take time to restore, unlike my demonic forces. For the crime of taking what's mine, that should be enough reason for me to kill you. And in the process of trying, you'll reveal yourself to be Ziraf, undermining all your work over these years playing the part of Emperor Spriggan. People may not know what Ziraf looks like thanks to your work over the years, but they remember his power. They'll know when you open the Gate of Solomon. Ichigo sighed, letting the kadu in his hand fade before bringing his hand down and scratching the back of his head. Look, I'm just here to talk. I hate you, you hate me, but for right now we need to put that aside. Or did you forget the crisis at hand when you took advantage of my absence? Did you like what you saw when you returned? Ziraf asked mockingly, briefly glancing towards Mavis in the distance. You must have been truly broken by what you saw if you finally decided to use Lumen Histoire's power. How many bodies were there, I wonder? Did you cry at the sight? I bet you did. Oh, it must have been dash. You were dead. Those words were enough to cause Ziraf to freeze in his tracks, forcing him to listen. Found you held by in one hand by Mimi-Heiji himself, dragged around like a life-sized doll. You hit the nail on the head when you said thought I found bodies, but it was the hundreds of thousands that I saw, both friend and foe alike, without a single drop of magic left in the world. That future is only a few days from now, and will happen in almost a day. You're lying. I'm here. Mavis is here, and I know you have seen her in her body before. That can only mean I saved her from Barragan, but if you pay close attention you know he's not dead yet, nor is Mavis free. Doubt me if you want, but tell me. Can you really afford to? What are your demands? Ziraf asked, having failed to speak multiple times before that. Just from looking at him Ichigo could tell that the man looked unsettled. Death was a close friend to Ziraf, but it hadn't ever been applied to himself. And death to Mimi-Heiji was not an end Ziraf would desire. For one so determined to die, he was very picky on how he died or who he died to. You wouldn't have come here without any, pointed out Ziraf, snapping him out of his thoughts. What is it that you want from me? To actual behave for once when people take their eyes off you, Ichigo snarkily muttered under his breath. Well, for starters, call a ceasefire. Let me stop Mimi-Heiji in peace without worrying about you killing half my friends when I turn my back. Agreed, Ziraf muttered in annoyance. I'll order my forces to hold their ground. But if they attack me I will kill them in retaliation. Just stop your army's advance. That will do for now. Fine. Next. Do you have anything that could stop magical barrier particles? Nothing on Mimi-Hagi's level, just something that can deal with large concentrations of it. With enough time, yes. Do you have that? For one pillar, sure. But for all of them? No, Ichigo grumbled out. Fine then. The last is a favor. I need you to dash. No. I wasn't finished. I know, Ziraf replied. The answer is no. It could stop Mimi-Heiji. Will it? I don't know, Ichigo admitted. But dash. I won't help you for a plan that at best is a maybe. Whatever you want me to do, are you willing to pay the cost? Is that cost my death? Ziraf merely smiled. For some. For others. Well, tell me what you want me to do. Ichigo paused, glancing back towards Mavis briefly. She was still waiting there patiently, looking on in worry. It would be easy enough to reassure her if he reached out for her mentally, but he couldn't do that. Not right now. Turning back to Ziraf he slowly sighed before beginning to walk closer. Activate your death field and you lose the one person capable of stopping Mimi-Heiji. Even you aren't that petty. You want to bet? Ichigo didn't stop until he was mere inches away from Ziraf, close enough that even he would struggle to back away in time without the power of his Bankai. Yes. Kill me, and you will and this world will die. Ziraf shrugged, by his death magic didn't activate, a sign that Ichigo took to proceed. I will have coordinates sent to you. Can you create a demon and have them monitor each and every one of them? I can. Is this the favor? Part of it. Sparing one last look back at Mavis, he settled his nerves before uttering the plan he had to Zeref. It's all I have right now. It may work, it may not. But if it does, I need your assistance at the end, as well as the bait to draw Mimi Heiji out. Just as you hate me, Mimi Heiji hates you. He will hunt you down, so make sure you are near the border of the two armies so that there are as many people as possible to hold him off. If all goes well, you only need to last less than a minute. Can you do it? That plan of yours. A smirk was aimed straight at him, the sadistic pleasure Zeref felt at that moment clear for him to see. I will gladly help. For what little I have to do, it is more than worth it. Make sure to give me a front row seat, won't you? I wouldn't want to miss this for the world. Good. Turning away, Ichigo paused briefly before uttering a few other words. After this, stop. There won't be any more worth to it afterwards. I promise you that. I find that hard to believe, abomination, Zeref muttered. I could promise you I would change my ways, but would you really trust a word that comes out of my mouth? Not if it's not in your own self-interests, Ichigo muttered. Be prepared for those coordinates. You'll receive them soon. And I swear to you, break this deal and Mimi Heiji won't be the one to kill you. I will. For once you have nothing to fear, Zeref called after him. Not from me at least. But this plan. Well, for once I'd say our interests are aligned. Protector of the fairies. Well? Anything. I've looked 3 times now, Hibiki stated with growing annoyance, not directed at him but rather the screen in front of the two of them. Nothing. Some vague details left over about this super weapon, but they're merely scraps of leftover data from whenever the information was purged. If there was an activation code in here for them, I'd find it. It has to be here. That's what I was told. Told by who exactly? Hibiki demanded, turning to look at Ichigo with a frown. When he noticed Ichigo glanced away sheepishly, he let out a sigh. Look, I don't mind doing this. If you really think there is something dangerous in here, I'll spend the next few hours scouring every file I can until something pops up or until I exhaust all possible avenues. But I can't perform miracles. The more I know what to look for, the more I can use that to narrow the search. I've told you all I know about Face, Ichigo stated. That should help, shouldn't it? Trust me when I say that it does, Hibiki confirmed for him. Knowing it utilizes magical barrier particles, and knowing what it pretended it could do, really gives me options to find information in Super Archive. I know what it could be hidden under, and can make some fairly informed guesses and leaps to find related information. But I can only search for information based on how I might hide it or how others might generally hide it. If I knew who was involved, I can try and put myself in their shoes, thinking of what they might do if they wanted this information to stay hidden. One of them is Mimi Heiji. You won't find anything on him to build up a profile. But if he was the only one involved, you wouldn't be this reluctant. Hibiki sighed, gesturing at the screen and tapping his fingers against it with one hand. I reckon that whoever hid this trigger you are looking for must have had Super Archive at some point. Am I wrong? Staying silent tells me a lot too, you know. I know, Ichigo muttered. You're really going to make me say it? It won't leave this room. At least not so long as he doesn't do anything himself. Ichigo nodded, lowering his voice to a whisper as he spoke. All right then. It's Juoshiro. Thank you, Hibiki replied honestly. I'll build a few profiles for him, extrapolating them out for possible personality changes. I can't trust his public face alone, and he might have more masks than we've seen past. If there is something here, if I find anything or if I think of anything, I'll let you know immediately. Until then it might be a long wait, so get something to eat maybe. I'll think I'll do that. By the way, do you know where Nozomi returned about an hour ago and is probably somewhere close by waiting for a chance to catch you when you don't look like the world is ending or that you have made a deal with the devil. That doesn't sound like her. You're right. She's probably used to those looks by now. Which means she may just waiting for you to come find her then. I told her the location of the Dragon Slayers, by the way. If you two have time, mind picking Laxus and the others up? I heard they defeated Acknowledge but are cut off from reaching us thanks to the army in between them and us. I'll do that, don't worry. Just remember to contact me if you find anything. Doesn't matter how insignificant it might be. It could make the difference between life and death. If means avoiding whatever future made you use Lumen Histo Ire, I'll do everything in my power. Ichigo paused briefly, glancing back at Hibiki who had gone to staring a large number of screens that now surrounded him. You checked that there were 2 of me, didn't you? You disappear to Alvarez and then reappear at a time like this? Half thought you were a spy at first, then realized I was picking up your magic on my sensors from 2 different locations. That only happened once before, and that was when we were escaping Waiwaka's grasp. From there it was easy enough to assume something went wrong. Something truly terrible indeed. Do you want to know? Ichigo asked. What happened, I mean? No, I don't think so, Hibiki said after a few moments of serious thought. It hasn't happened yet, and hopefully it won't. Maybe once we know the danger has passed I might be curious, 1 or 2 years down the line. Right now though, I'm fine just knowing what I need to know to do this job. Speaking of which, I'll leave you to it then. Leaving Hibiki behind, Ichigo quickly exited the tent to find Mest and Mavis waiting there for him, the body of Doran Bolt surprisingly missing. What happened to Dash? Myself? Dumped him in a bed with Fairy Tail to keep an eye on him. He shouldn't wake up anytime soon, and the commands that controlled him are gone now, but on the off chance he could do anything, I've told them to seal his magic away with some Sekizeki cuffs just to be safe. Though I'm sure Juushiro knows you aren't where he wanted you after you stopped Zeref's forces. He doesn't seem to want to accelerate his timetable though, which could mean a lot of things. He's confident that he'll win, Mavis pointed out quietly, pulling the hood of her cloak down further as they all fell silent as a few soldiers passed by too closely for them to risk continuing and being overheard. Mavis waited patiently, one foot anxiously tapping the ground until they passed, before she continued. Whatever moves we take don't seem to concern him if he doesn't plan to activate face early. Perhaps he thinks the trigger is too well hidden. Or perhaps there is a variety of other things he can fall back on that render our actions meaningless. There's too many unknowns. Hopefully Hibiki finds something, Ichigo muttered. Beyond that though, we need to start thinking of alternatives. So long as there is the risk of Mimi-Heiji being able to activate face remotely at any time he wants, we can't just recklessly approach him. If we could take him down in one strike it would be ideal, but he'll be on guard now if he even senses me in the nearby vicinity. Time isn't on our side much here, Mest pointed out. We don't have many options left at all. Given a bit of time I'm sure we could create some kind of neutralizer. Get Kisuke and Hades in a room together with one of the pillars and they could create a prototype in hours. But mass producing it and distributing it would take weeks considering the sheer numbers we are dealing with. Destroying them all at once would be the most ideal plan, Mavis added in annoyance. But we'd never manage it. With so many sites scattered across the land, we'd need thousands of people being synchronized to strike at the same time, or at least similar enough times so that Mimi-Heiji wouldn't realize. However, we wouldn't be able to hide the disappearance of the amount of people needed for such an undertaking, plus we'd have to locate every pillar too in order for it to be even viable. We'd be lucky if Hibiki could even find them all with Super Archive given the time left. What if we focused locally? Mest asked. If we can't clear all of them, why not at least try and destroy the ones in the nearby vicinity? It would allow some of magic to remain at least. I did consider that, Ichigo admitted. But if Mimi-Heiji is allowed to then manifest completely in the areas without even a trace of magic, and then comes to fight me, we won't win. Mimi-Heiji beat over 100 Ukin if Ichibe is to be believed, and he did so when they had the home advantage. If he activates face, the world will have more magical barrier particles in it than magic. And if that happens, I won't be able to beat him. He'll be too strong then. Is there any possibility you could beat him if he manifested fully? Ichigo shook his head. No. He's powerful enough as it is, but the situation would be too advantageous for him on top of that. We need to find a way to prevent the loss of magic, else our one chance of standing up to him goes up in smoke. He sighed, shaking his head as ideas refused to form. Keep thinking if you can. I need to clear my head for a bit. Will do, Mest stated. If you don't mind, I do want to consult a bit with others. I'll keep it to a select few, but if Kisuk or Hades have even a single possible solution dash. I know, Ichigo said as he cut him off. Go. If you can't find me when you get back, get Hibiki to contact me for you. I just need to clear my head for a bit. Mest gave a brief nod before disappearing, leaving Ichigo and Mavis in silence for a few moments as they considered the best thing to say. Eventually she merely took his hand, giving it a reassuring squeeze. We'll figure out a way. Don't lose hope yet. I'll do my best. Don't worry about me. I wouldn't be if you would tell me what you were talking about with Zeref. Ichigo shook his head. Just an idea I've got. I'm trying not to think about it much yet until we run out of options. Mavis nodded. Probably a dangerous one then. Run the details by me and I'll see what I can do to increase its chances. He couldn't say it. Not yet. He was glad when he didn't need to, his focus being stolen by a familiar face leaning in to look at him. Nozomi. You seem different, she said, ignoring how sudden she had arrived and avoiding bothering with any pleasantries. It was always straight to the point with her. How bad was it? He could tell. Without even having to explain it, she already knew. She knew he had traveled back and knew he had seen something terrible. Seeing her now, he remembered seeing her back then. Her lifeless body, motionless in a field of corpses. Another number in an endless count, dead before he even had a chance to see her again, and before he knew it he had wrapped his arms around her and pulled her close, clinging to her like she'd disappear if he let go. She didn't say anything, and neither did he. He did feel her hands slowly snake around his back, rubbing soothing circles as a form of comfort as she let him be. This was cruel in some ways. He knew how she felt, and something like this wasn't something he should do when he had rejected her once. But the sight of her dead body was one he was desperately trying to dismiss right now, her presence here reassuring him that it was yet to happen. He had always thought time travel was best avoided because of how dangerous a temptation it could be. He hadn't thought it could be cruel too. You could see things that might never happen in another timeline, but the memory itself would remain even if that future was avoided. It was something that could never be forgotten by the one who experienced it. Just as he would save her and everyone else, he also had failed them all too. Nozomi. Would you mind accompanying me for a while? He asked her softly. There are some people I need to see. Protector of the fairies. I'm so hungry. Exclaimed Natsu, clutching his stomach in pain. Someone make some fire already. How about some sympathy for the rest of us? Laxus snapped, doing his best to try and create a natural fire to keep them warm for the night. Not all of us can eat an element. Besides, don't you technically have some of sky magic in you? Eat the air. I tried that, Natsu grumbled back. Not cost-effective enough. You try if you don't believe me. I'll take your word for it, he shot back in annoyance, the sound of metal being crunched drawing his focus. And Gajeel, if you're going to find metal to eat, can we at least use it to start a fire first? Just ask Salamander to start one. He won't get anything from eating his own energy. Gajeel scoffed before chucking 2 pieces of metal over. I want them back once you're done, he said, chewing on a 3rd piece while he waited. The metal around here's not that pure and those pieces are the tastiest ones I've found so far. I can't believe I'd one day be stuck listening to a conversation about eating elements for sustenance, Jin chimed in with dryly. Serena hardly bothered with this if it wasn't enemy magic. It's the same reason Laxus isn't thinking to try much, Sting called out. Those who obtained Dragon Slayer magic from Lacrimas didn't grow up raised by dragons. Sometimes we eat meat, sometimes magic. You learn to favor both. I don't think you grew up bathing in shadows, however, Jin pointed out, barely needing to glance over to know that Sting was still lying under an outcrop of rocks in as much darkness as he could find. Is that even comfortable? Not at all, Sting muttered back. I can feel at least 5 rocks poking into my back, and the taste of shadows isn't something I'm used to. But it's food for me all the same. Don't you need to use your dual element mode for that? Gajeel asked, getting a grunt of acknowledgement in return. Don't blame me if you run out of magic doing it that way. Why do you think I'm putting up with this? Sting shot back. If I don't move and stay in this much darkness under here, I can keep my levels equal. It would be a bit less uncomfortable if someone would stop sucking up all the air admittedly. A nervous gulp came over from Wendy as she covered her mouth with her hands. I'm sorry, she managed to get out as muffled words, looking honestly apologetic, before she tried to subtly go back to eating the air a little less enthusiastically as before. None of them had the heart to tell her to stop, not when she was the youngest out of all of them and had been slow at recovering her magic too. Out of all their wounds, her self-inflicted ones from the overuse of nirvana were the ones furthest from healing, limiting her ability to replenish her magic greatly. Don't worry about it too much, Wendy, Levy tried to say reassuringly, one hand tightly covering her stomach as if hoping it would keep it silent. He's just jealous you can eat the most out of all of us. She was too, admittedly, though it was aimed at all of them. Even Jin, who she had seen drink some suspicious-looking liquid when he thought none of them were looking. Ever since he hadn't even looked hungry, so she had a pretty good idea of what had been in that bottle. If we could work out where some food is, I could try and get you some, Levy, Wendy offered quietly. I just need to. I can't. Why not? She sighed sadly, turning back from the air she had briefly looked to in order to apologize. Sorry. Forget it. Nabara not letting you. Wendy nodded silently, wrapping her arms around her legs as she pulled them closer to her body. Said he's worried. About me overdoing it. Well. It wasn't exactly an unfounded accusation considering what Wendy had done not that long ago. She had gotten to the point where she had fried her own ability to take in magic, and while she could bypass that by digesting it from air, it still didn't take away the damage she had yet to recover from or the magic she was still lacking. It was no surprise that the spirit that inhabited Nirvana would want to limit her use of the magic for a bit until it was sure she was fine. I suppose he's probably right. You might go a bit overboard. I wouldn't. Wendy flinched and trailed off, looking away from the patch of air she had briefly glanced. All right, I would. But if it meant you wouldn't starving. It would just be a bit of pain at worst. Levy sighed. That's a slippery slope there. This is coming from someone who watching someone tumble down that slope without thinking about what was at the end. Besides, hunger won't kill me at the moment. Give it a bit over a day thought and then I might have to take you up on that offer. You won't have to wait that long, Laxus called over, Levy realizing she had either spoken a bit too loudly or his newly enhanced hearing had picked it up with ease. Likely the latter based on how no one else reacted until he spoke, which made her wonder how much he had been hearing that she thought had been whispered under her breath. Suddenly her quiet complaints to herself didn't seem so private anymore. We'll steal some from the enemy if we really have to. Hopefully not until we are forced into battle again, Jin pointed out, one hand gesturing towards the sight of the army in the distance. There was no doubt there was at least 100 men and women watching them from a variety of angles, reporting on their every move. And it was that very army that stood between them and their allies. It was impossible to simply go around a force of this side. One of Alvarez's greatest strengths was their sheer numbers. Flying over them was also out of the question due to their still fairly low reserves of magical power, and unless they were extremely high up they would be easy targets to those on the ground with ranged magic. Time had not been on their side and so they had been forced to try and push through, hoping to use what little power they had in a method to merely cut through and regroup as quickly as possible. It had gone both better and worse than they had hoped. Better because the enemy had been much warier of them than they had initially prepared for, meaning they were far more easily intimidated by shows of large-scale destruction. Worse because that was what it took to make the army back away far enough to not slice them to pieces with whatever weapons they had on them. This brief peace was a blessing really, allowing them time to once again recover magically, physically, and mentally. It would be good news for Ishgar too, since this peace appeared to be universal, not just merely with them. And all they knew was that Ziraf had struck a deal with Ichigo. That alone had been enough to make Jin fall silent, thinking back to every memory he had of Ziraf and comparing it against his current actions. He had said as much to the others, but the idea of Ziraf willingly making a deal like this with Ichigo was ludicrous. It offered too much to Ichigo and gave little to Ziraf, at least on the surface. Too many times now he had been terrified of what exactly Ichigo had offered to make Ziref even agree to this, as unless it was something Ziref truly desired he was sure Ziref would have rejected the offer out of spite. And there were few things Ziref truly desired in this world, one of which was sitting near him in what the Dark Mage would call a ruined state. Perhaps he was overthinking things. He hoped to God he was. He should focus instead on trying to get what little information he had to Jushiro before it went out of date. Hopefully August had not yet managed to make it to Magnolia. This temporary peace made him think that he hadn't, but August could have very well have infiltrated and was using this moment now to take control of the city and the Fairy Tale Guild Hall, where supposedly the power of Lumen Histoire was hidden away. What do you think Ichigo's planning? Jin heard Toshiro briefly say from beside him. He raised an eyebrow in surprise as the white-haired Shinigami's eyes opened for the first time in an hour, his hands still resting on his Zanpakuto from his meditation. You have an idea, right? Not a clue, Jin replied honestly. He really shouldn't be here if we're being truthful though. Ziref's actions up to this point were based on that fact. Ziref really wanted Ichigo to return to find a wasteland filled with corpses, his home destroyed with rivers of blood flowing through streets. Not a pleasant picture for any of us, but worse for the one it's intended for. Ichigo's appearance has upset that, and even I don't know what Ziref's next move is. If I can't predict Ziref's, there is no way I could know what Ichigo is planning. I see. That's it. Jin asked in disbelief as Toshiro closed his eyes once more, looking like he was about to go back into meditation once again. First words in an hour and you're going straight back to talking with your sword. It helps me focus, Toshiro stated. And it's a part of me. It may know an answer I have overlooked. Or you could be wasting your time. Maybe. But there isn't much else I can do right now. If anything urgent happens Yeah, shake you awake. I know. I don't know how he manages to do that, Natsu called out once he was sure Toshiro had gone back into his inner world. Does he get hungry at all in there? If not, lucky. I'm starving. Natsu for the last time Laxus snapped out, the metal cracking a bit in his grip, before a small green portal snapped open in the space between all of them. The metal slipped from his hand in shock and even Toshiro opened one eye to glance at the sight, the surge of familiar magical power enough to draw his attention. Ah, here they are, came a familiar voice, the portal widening until it was large enough for a person to step through. Glancing around, Ichigo raised a hand in greeting while holding a large bag of food in another. I got your location from Nozomi, he said as she followed him through after Mavis, closing the portal sharply behind them. Thought you might be food. Natsu wasted no time in abandoning his efforts to watching Laxus start a fire to grab the bag from his hand, digging around in it for something to eat. You're the best, Ichigo. He just brought a bit of food, Laxus pointed out, chucking the iron back over to Gajeel, who wasn't being very hasty at rushing over like Natsu. He wished he could say the same about the others as they were quickly swarming over, even Jin, though the man was trying to be a lot more subtle about it. Ah, what the hell, he muttered, letting his arm dart out and snake its way under the others to sneakily grab some stuff before they could take it all. As his arm came back he noticed Ichigo watching him, a brief thought crossing his mind about why until he realized. This form was new to Ichigo, even if he had seen the half-finished state of it before the fight. Guess you have a lot of questions, he said half-heartedly. Mind waiting a few minutes for those answers? That's fine, Ichigo replied. When you have time, I'd prefer it if you start with why Ziref only has one arm now. That one. That's a long story. Protector of the fairies. Kindness from cruelty. That's one hell of a story, Laxus muttered, leaning his chin on his hand for support. Letting out a tired sigh, he added, wish you had brought some drinks with you. I kind of wish I could forget some of it for a little bit. The last thing we need right now is you getting drunk, hissed Levi, her irritation briefly dimming as a random thought occurred. Can you even get drunk actual? Or would it take a lot more to do it now? Give me a day or two after this war ends and I'll find out. I'm sure there are some kegs buried deep enough in Fairy Tale that haven't been looted or destroyed. As wonderful as this conversation sounds, is this really the time for it? Asked Mavis. There's still the urgent . It's fine, Mavis, interrupted Ichigo, waving away her concerns. We can spare a few more minutes. We are dealing with mere hours now, not days. You realize that, don't you? We still haven't even got a proper plan in place. We're wasting time here. Sighing, he gestured slightly towards Nozomi. If it bothers you so much, we will be leaving soon. Could you ask Nozomi to prepare a portal to our next stop? I promise I'll be quick. Just a few more minutes. Mavis frowned before reluctantly getting to her feet, walking slowly away as Ichigo turned back, the carefree expression he had shown slowly fading away. You going to tell her you already have a plan in mind or not? Levi asked curiously, keeping her voice low enough so that Mavis didn't overhear it while she was still nearby. That's a surprise really. Considering her loyalty to you, I would have figured she's one of your biggest confidants. Even more so than Nozomi or Mistagen. Is it that obvious I'm lying here? Not really, Levi replied carefully. Just a feeling. I've grown accustomed to seeing the masks you try to show people when you want to hide something. This one is similar, though a bit unfamiliar. Considering past events, that makes me a bit worried honestly. There's also the fact you're here, now, of all times, Laxus pointed out, crossing his arms. I'm thankful for the food. It was delicious, and we were really hungry. Fighting Aknologia took a lot out of us, and trying to break through Alvarez's forces was even more draining after that whole ordeal. But we would have been fine. You didn't need to come, and if you were worried you could have sent Nozomi alone while you went to work elsewhere. So long as we won't going to die anytime soon, and judging by that story you told us it appears we would be safe from this army if it was Mimi Heiji who killed us, then you could have left us alone. But instead you came to see us, putting on a smile and taking time to relax that you should really need right now. Yes, Laxus muttered, this is time you should be using to prepare for Mimi Hagi's arrival. The fact you said his host is the chairman makes this whole situation more difficult, which only emphasizes the importance of these current moments. And yet you are here instead. Only reason that would be is if you didn't need this time. You wouldn't need it if you already knew what you were going to do. Ichigo merely smiled. Would you like to know? If you want, I'll tell you. Would the answer be the truth? Or a kindness? Laxus sighed, shaking his head. If you won't even tell Mavis what this plan is, you won't tell us. Because there is something about this plan that none of us would like. If you truly wanted it, I would tell you the truth here. I'm not lying, but I would ask you to keep it quiet. It's your choice. No, Laxus muttered, shaking his head. I shouldn't know. You probably have already thought long and hard about this plan. Just, if there's an alternative. Ichigo nodded. I'll take it, don't worry. Personally I'd rather than. I'm hoping someone else will think of something, or that even I will think of something else. But I have to be prepared. I know how I can stop Mimi Heiji through one method, but that's it. Only one method. What happens after that? To the other you? Levi asked curiously. I've read enough books to know that time travel can be treated in a lot of ways, but in almost all of them paradoxes are something to be wary of. And you're not merely making one right now, you're betting the world on it. If you do beat Mimi Heiji, what will happen to the paradox? Your own reason for coming back will be removed, but if it is removed then Mimi Heiji wouldn't have been beaten. Time will try to fix itself, Ichigo muttered. What that means for me is not certain. Mavis once told me that her presence and bond to be would protect me, but does that extend to my past self too in such a situation if her past self is bonded to him? Potentially the oldest existence may remain while the younger is destroyed. Or maybe we will both continue to persist. I don't know, but part of me believes it'll be the former. Ichigo. You done yet? Almost Mavis, he called back before returning his attention to the others. For now, could you help me with something? Both Levi and Laxus nodded together. Anything you want, she said for the two of them, adopting a serious look on her face. What do you need us to do? I need you to buy me some time, Ichigo said before chuckling. This is odd. Normally I would ask the people I care about to stay away from danger, not run straight towards it. For once you've realized we wouldn't listen if you told us to stay away in the first place. I suppose. Glancing briefly at the other dragon slayers and Jin discreetly, he added, I need you all to work with Ziref. To Laxus and Levi's credit, they didn't say anything to alert the others. They merely did their best to hide the distaste they had at such an idea. Will it help you? Laxus asked reluctantly. Will he even agree to this? He has, Ichigo muttered, causing a look of concern in return. Don't give me that look, I know how unlikely it sounds. But he knows the danger we're facing. He can put aside his grudges for a few hours. Can he? Levi asked in disbelief. He continued the war the moment Acknowledge died to take advantage of your absence, despite the danger that was present then. This time I made it worth his while to listen. Now you won't be working with him for long. Likely a few minutes at worst. In the possibility that Face activates and Mimi Heiji arrives, he needs to be contained. You won't be able to kill him. I'd be surprised if you even could harm him. He will be similar to a force of nature, ignoring everything you do to try and stop him before pushing you all aside as if you were mere obstacles in his path. So don't try and beat him. Just try and contain the damage he causes. After that, I can take it from there. His power will eat away at our own right. Asked Levi. Tricky that. I doubt my spells could contain him for more than a second at best. You won't be alone. None of you will be, so don't try and do anything alone. He killed everyone but me in the future, and even then I could tell that wasn't his full strength. Don't give him a reason to kill you if you can. Slow him down but make sure it's easy for him to get you out of the way. If my hunch is correct, his target will be Ziref. It'll be the time when Ziref is completely mortal, and Mimi Heiji won't be able to resist striking him down because of his grudge against all things magic. Ichigo. We need to go. And that's my cue, Ichigo muttered in annoyance, getting to his feet. Sorry I couldn't stay any longer. Thanks for the information about what I missed in regards to Acknowledge and Ziref. Knowing how his immortality works finally opens up a lot of possibilities to explore, given enough time. Hold on one moment, Laxus said, stopping Ichigo as he made to turn away. Beating Mimi Heiji. I think I know the worst case. Is there a best one? Ichigo paused, an uncertain smile appearing on his face briefly. I'd quite like to go home. I'm sure it's a mess after over 7 years of neglect, but it's where a lot began for us. The best case finds us there. Protector of the Fairies. Arriving at the city of Magnolia, Ichigo glanced around at the surroundings at where the guild hall's remains still rested. Some of it had been cleared away since the last time he had been here, but most people seemed to shy away from the area. Whether it was a show of respect to Fairy Tail while they were away or fear that had been generated of the place during the 7 years that it was ruled by Raven Tail, he wasn't sure. Right now though he didn't mind the place being isolated. It meant people weren't really watching as he pulled open the hidden trapdoor and dropped down through it, holding it open long enough for Mavis and Nozomi to follow after. Has this place always been here? Nozomi asked as they walked down the steps, getting a chuckle from Mavis. Was it something I said? Not really, she replied fondly. Everyone seems to react like this. It makes the effort that Precht went to hide this place worth every inch. Who else has been down here? Not many really, Ichigo replied. All the previous guild masters end up coming down here, which is why Laxus saw it recently. The gods of Ishgar knew about this place too thanks to Warod, and of course I know about this place due to Mavis telling me. Beyond that it's a closely guarded secret. It hasn't stopped people like Yvonne from Raventail or others like Ziref from learning of this place, the former actual having been down here, but all they would have reached is the door below. That's all. If you've been down here before, why not just give me the position to teleport us down here? Mavis knows it right. I do, confirmed Mavis, but you'd find your aim drastically off. Properly in a wall somewhere. Once we get deep enough you might be able to sense the wards involved due to your familiarity with spatial magic. They disrupt anyone from getting in or out of this place, meaning the only way down is the path we're going. Or to blow away the ground, but that kind of method normally does negate a lot of safety methods. It's why secrecy was the first line of defense first and foremost. To hide the vault. Vault. I'll show you what you mean when we get there, Mavis said, throwing Nozomi a cheeky grin. It's all Precht's work, you know. He may have done some terrible things, but he was always a genius, and this is some of his most impressive stuff yet. You seem to be in a more cheerful mood than before, Ichigo pointed out, Mavis throwing a glare at him in response. Just saying. Maybe it's because I have a rough idea of what you're planning, she said, causing him to raise an eyebrow. What, it's clear as day. And that's a reason to be a bit happier since we're making progress again. No offense to your friends though. If it was any other time. I know Mavis, Ichigo said to her reassuringly. So you think you have an idea, right? You must have ideas of your own too. Care to share any with me? Mavis nodded, rambling off a few ideas she had off the top of her head. All the while he listened to them, dismissing some while asking about others. Many of them couldn't work, but some had promise. But they all had one shared idea, so he could easily understand what Mavis was thinking currently in regards to this place. Letting his thoughts drift off as he allowed his feet to carry him forward automatically, he was drawn back at the sound of surprise coming from Nozomi as they entered the large open space before the vault room itself. The doorway remained closed like always, a last defense against those who would find this place to ensure the belief that Mavis's body was within would remain. Watch your step, Ichigo muttered, bypassing some of the broken rubble from around the room as he made his way to the doorway, the only piece untouched by the damage that surrounded them. The seals off the door glowed a bit brighter with his approach, their light only intensifying as he raised a hand up towards them. An open sesame, Mavis exclaimed, leaping from his shoulders as the doors began to open. Spinning round a few times, she came to a stop before the widening gap, one hand being held back towards the sight being revealed to them. May I present to you my old tomb? Nozomi's eyes widened at the sight before her, rushing forward to the edge of the doorway and merely peering into the room. What she could only assume was where the edge of the room should be was nothing more than a void. Everything around the room's edges was, and as she took a few more steps in and peered off the walkway she saw nothing below them but the empty void itself. You recognize this for what it is, right? Asked Mavis, picking up a small bit of rubble, tiny enough that she could hold it easily in the palm of her hand, before dropping it over the edge. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, SIO, there it is. Nozomi's eyes widened as the same item Mavis had dropped flew past their faces from above. Another few seconds later and she saw it pass once again, and again, and again and again. An endless loop. Is this entire place a loop of spatial magic? That it is, Mavis confirmed. Precht did his best to sustain my magic and keep it hidden, and the collision of his intelligence and my uncontrollable leakage of raw power created this. I'll show you where I was sealed if you want. 1 second, Mavis, Ichigo called out, his hand to his eye. I want to do some checks for a moment. Do you mind? Mavis shook her head, immediately getting what he was after and reaching up for her fake eye like he was. Together the two allowed them to turn back to their raw state of energy and flow into the knife that formed in Ichigo's hand. Knock yourself out. Let me know if you see anything good, she said, casually walking towards the end of the walkway. Nozomi made to follow only for a hand to catch her by the arm, locking her in place. Got to say, this place does bring back memories, Mavis spoke loudly to them as she reached the platform's end, spreading out her arms as she stood where she had once been sealed. Odd being back here like this. Took over 100 years, but I'm finally back in my body once again. Every other time I was here I could only look at it enviously. Or not at all when it was stolen from me. Mavis, Ichigo called out to her. The spatial magic at the edge of the room. How effective would it be at keeping someone in? Say no more, Mavis exclaimed, glancing at the edges of the room in front of her and to the sides. She even peered up and down once, muttering a few times to herself as she did the calculations. I did think this is what you were after when you brought us down here. You wanted to evaluate this room's potential as a prison. It's certainly an effective one. The spatial magic lining this room stops anyone getting in or out, and it wouldn't be possible to break it without expending some serious raw power over a long period of time, enough to slowly wear down the runes holding this whole structure together. A normal person would never escape alive, Mavis added, carefully double-checking her calculations. Most mages too. If they knew spatial magic, then their chances of survival rise significantly, but not nearly as much to make a difference. It would go from 0 to 5, maybe 10% chance to make it out alive. And even that would take years. No, that's too short. Decades, close to a century if not more. Even if these runes are old now, they were made to sustain the pressure from the magical power my body was releasing passively to keep it all sealed in here. Depending on the mage's strength would determine if it was possible in their lifetime or not. I'm not talking about just anyone, Mavis. I know, she called out knowingly. You want to know whether it could hold Mimi Heiji, right? And the answer to that is, I don't know. Ichigo didn't reply to that, but Mavis didn't expect him to. It wasn't the answer he wanted to hear, but he didn't want to voice that disappointment. If we're talking about any form of Mimi Heiji, partially or completely manifested, this place won't hold him. Hell, there are many people it won't hold forever, but he is the one would always break free the fastest. Thinking carefully, she added, if we could get him in here while he was still Jushiro, it might block the connection to Mimi Heiji. But that's assuming the connection works on a way this room could even block. And if Mimi Heiji could manifest in any way, he'd be able to easily tear this room apart. The saving grace is merely time. At a fraction of his strength, it could hold for probably 20 minutes. That's a decent while, all things considered. I'm overestimating probably, Mavis admitted. At full strength it would be seconds rather than minutes. If we were lucky it would hold for 30 seconds, but it could go in as little as 10 seconds. This room is nearing its limit in the first place, and it would be so easy for magical barrier particles to give it the final push to its end. However, it's not without merit, this idea, Mavis added. If we could get him in here somehow, that is time we have. Time that he can't stop us and that we can use for our own plans. Perhaps if we could push all our magical power together into one attack and use it to crush Mimi Heiji with raw force. That's assuming he wouldn't bring out the same level of power to counter and surpass us, though. You said this room was nearing its limit, Ichigo called out to her. How much longer could it have contained you? She glanced at the walls once again, frowning slightly as she tried to work it out. Held well over 100 years, but if the erosion happened how I think it did, probably would have worked for another 5 years just from my passive energy flooding the room. What about it? You were actively trying to break out. At this level? Mavis scoffed. Probably merely hours. Passively dealing with my magical power is one thing. Facing it actively and dealing with a greater quantity being released would undoubtedly help tear it down faster. Not that it helps much. Why do you want to? Ichigo. She sharply turned round at the sound of rumbling, the sight of the doorway beginning to close. Ichigo. What are you doing? I'm sorry, Mavis, she heard him call out, his voice getting louder. He hadn't made any effect to do that though. She was merely getting closer as she sprinted down the walkway. This is the only way. Wait, stop. She exclaimed. Hold on a minute, what are you doing? I'm still in here. Just let me dash. That's the point, Mavis, Ichigo said in shame. I can't allow you to come with me any further. What? Why? She was so close, doing her best to put on one last burst of speed. But the doorway closed too quickly, her last sight beyond it being the set eyes of Ichigo before it clicked shut, her hand slamming against the flat surface as she desperately trying to find purchase on it to use to help pull it open. I'm sorry. Despite the barrier between them though, their connection wasn't broken. It was quieter, but the very fact Ichigo held the knife that bound the two of them meant that not even this door could shatter this bond. As long as he held it, he could hear her. So why did she hear his thoughts as he prepared to release it? Don't. She desperately begged, stopping him before he would have released his hold on the knife on the other side. Why? She asked, a silence falling on the other side. Why are you doing this? Is this a joke? I'm Dash. I don't want to hear it. She cried out, slamming her fists against the doorway as if it would break down the barrier separating the two of them. No apologizes. No excuses. I'll forgive you if you open the door right now. It can just be a little prank. I can't do that. Why? She demanded. The two of us are a team. How are you going to get Mimi Heiji here without me? I'm not. But dash. I never said I was going to use this place to keep him trapped, Ichigo said to her. I'm sorry. I truly am. I didn't want to do this. But this is the only place that I know of that will make sure you can't stop me. Can't stop you. Her body began to shiver, dark thoughts filling her head before she tore into the memories Ichigo had that she could reach for. He didn't stop her. Whether it was because he couldn't or wouldn't, she didn't know. All she knew was what she saw in this memories. The plan he had hidden from her. And now she knew why. No. No, she sobbed, desperately clawing at the door as she tried to reach out through it to him. Please no. No 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 no. I'm begging you no. Not this. Anything but this. I've tried to think up another solution. But there isn't another. Neither I, nor you, nor anyone else that we consulted with could find a way to beat Mimi Heiji. Because there wasn't. Not with the power we all possess. The chances to stop him before he activates face are tiny. The chances to stop him afterwards don't even exist. But with this, I gives us a chance. But you'll. She couldn't say it. It hurt too much. I know, she heard him said to her softly. Worst of all is that I'm leaving you alone again. Then take me with you. She immediately declared. If this is what must be done, let me be there to the end. Did you forget? The two of us are bound together forever. If this is what must happen, then let me be there with you. I'm sorry Mavis, she heard him utter, crushing what little hopes she had. But I'm being selfish here. I won't subject you to the same fate. I won't drag you down with me. That's not fair. I don't care. Just please, don't leave me, she begged. I don't want to be alone. She managed to spit out between sobs. Please. Not again. Not when I waited, for so long. Mavis. I waited so many years, considered so many people, and I decided on you the second I saw you. Years passed before our second meeting, more until we were able to speak again, and then finally I had a partner that would never leave me. Don't make me go back. Not to that emptiness. Please. If you start to feel lonely, then please find someone else, Ichigo muttered softly. Someone won't let you down. Someone who isn't me. But I don't want them. If it's not you. Please. Goodbye Mavis. Wait. Don't go. It was too late. She felt the connection dull until she could no longer hear his voice. While she could still sense the bond between them, with the dagger no longer in contact with either of them, the connection wasn't strong enough to break through the spatial magic surrounding her. He was gone, leaving her as he headed somewhere he did not want her to follow. Come back, she sobbed out, slamming her fists against the doorway repeatedly, uncaring of the pain it sent through her body or how her magical power was beginning to lash out uncontrollably. Come back! Come back! Come back! She cried out, a wave of magical power slamming out all around her and harmless bouncing off against the doorway. The result only caused her to cry more, her tears falling unopposed as her voice screamed out into the empty void around her. She was alone once more, and would be for all eternity. Because she had known from what she had seen in his head that there was one single truth that mattered right now. Ichigo wouldn't ever come back to this place. Protector of the fairies. You want to say something, don't you? Ichigo asked as the two of them waited for Mest, Ichigo letting his legs rest as he sat on the edge of the small porch of his old home, running a hand across some of the overgrown plants that had encroached into the place he had once called home. You don't have to stay silent like that. It's nothing. Ichigo sighed, glancing up at her and noticing how she couldn't seem to settle on how to look at the current moment. Was she ashamed of him? Angry at him? Or simply confused at him? I'm not going to bite. Say whatever you want. We're no longer at the stage where you need to hold back your words around me. Nozomi nodded, taking a minute to compose herself before immediately opening with, that was cruel. Which part? The door or the conversation afterwards? Both, stated Nozomi. She hadn't heard what had been spoken between him and Mavis, but the look on his face had revealed a lot. So why did you do it? Would you believe me if I said it was to protect her? Yes. But it would still be cruel. Ichigo nodded, a sad look crossing his face briefly as he remembered the sound of Mavis's broken voice. I agree. What I did was cruel. Crueler than you probably think. For Mavis, the most important thing was for us to be together. She waited so long for that first meeting we had, and since that day has never left my side for long. In her mind, she would be with me until death. And ideally, she'd die with me. That is the kind of partnership Mavis desired. But her desires stem from a desperation to avoid being alone again. Mine stem from a desire to protect others. There was no way I could ever have her follow me to this final stage. Nozomi let out a sharp breath. Then it's true. You plan to die. Plan to? That's absurd. I have no intention of dying. And yet you stopped her, Nozomi pointed out. You won't let her continue with you. And right now you've been visiting place after place, each with little relevance to the enemy you have to face. Seeing Laxus and Levi, ensuring Mavis would be kept away to stop her interfering, and now resting here in your old home. This isn't you struggling to think of another plan. This is you having one and not seeing a way out of it. This is your farewell tour. Ichigo shifted slightly, turning his head up to look at her with a sad smile. Tell me, how would you beat Mimi Heiji? I don't know, Nozomi admitted. In the face of magical barrier particles, most plans get thrown out the window. And extrapolating up to account for his level of power. I don't know how he could be stopped. For a while, neither did I, Ichigo admitted. But then I thought of something. The way I heard the story once go, Mimi Heiji was beaten when only a few Ukin remained. Why did he lose? Was there something about the Ukin that remained? Or was it because there was fewer that they could do more? It presented a possibility in my mind, one that I'm not even sure I can pull off. But if works, I may be able to beat Mimi Heiji. But that also means facing him. It's a battle you don't believe you will survive. My chances are slim, Ichigo muttered. Though perhaps not for the reason you think. Walking away from that battle will be hard. I don't even know if I can win. But it's the only shot I have. None of us could think of anything else that could work. The only option left is this. Chuckling dryly, Ichigo added, and do you know what bothers me the most? Now that I want to live, I'm facing with only the option that could mean my death. Even as I begin to change, I find my options pointing right towards the path I've followed from the start. Just when I was finally looking forward to seeing what could happen after this war. He let out a large sigh, pushing off the porch and getting to his feet. So much I wish I could do. Neither knew what to say to that. Neither truly wanted to. One would have to acknowledge the pain from what he would never get to see, the other having to realize the things she would have forever lost. But despite all of that, one of them did eventually manage to find the courage to speak. You said your chances of survival are slim, Nozomi whispered, barely loud enough for him to hear her. That means there is a possibility that you will live, right? That all of these precautions will be for nothing. Ichigo muttered. If that happens, Mavis will be furious at me. But I don't mind that. I'd want to hear her shouting at me, calling me all kinds of names. Even hating me would be fine. And you'd see Laxus and Levi again. Thinking about that makes me imagine they'd join in with Mavis, Ichigo chuckled. And you could, do more. Like ask you what I said I would. Ichigo turned to her once again, his expression falling. No, I shouldn't say anything right now. That would be too cruel. You could, Nozomi stated. Because it would be easy for me to forget it when you have wipe away my memory of you. Ichigo paused, prepared to deny her words before he caught the slight sight of movement near the edge of the trees. The glint of a scythe's blade near the base of the tree was enough to give away who it was, and going by Nozomi's response he assumed she had known he was there for some time. You didn't realize he was here yet. A soft smile grew on Nozomi's face briefly before she could hide it. Perhaps I was overthinking things. It's good that you were, Ichigo admitted, turning away slightly out of shame. He hadn't planned for what Nozomi had thought he had Mest prepared to do. But that didn't change the fact Mest had been prepared anyway for any signal he would give. His future self had once done this in order to make it easier for his old friends to see him as an enemy to spare them the pain. That same man, and the person this war had slowly been turning him into, would have done the same here to spare people the pain that his potential death might cause. It would be easy to order Mest to move in now. Only. Is it selfish? He asked Nozomi. I know it will hurt those that remember me if I die. But I don't want to be forgotten. I don't want to lose these bonds. Even if it means I have to give up protecting you all from this pain. Isn't that fine? Nozomi asked. That's normal, to want what you do. If anything, your desire to protect us all has always taken you too far. So it's fine, Ichigo. If you died, I wouldn't want to forget you just because it would mean I'd be spared from pain. No one would want that. In the first place, it would be more cruel than kind. You can come out now, Mest, Ichigo called out, slowly walking towards the teleporter before pausing beside Nozomi. This is where we part. Nozomi frowned. If you think I'll leave you here after all this dash. You will, Ichigo stated. Because to follow me now will cause you nothing but pain if things go south. And it may make me say things I'll regret. Words that shouldn't ever mean something cruel, but will if the worst happens. Instead, I'd ask you to do what you can here and help keep as many people alive as possible. What about you? I'll be there shortly, Ichigo stated. Just survive hell for a short while, and then I'll do everything I can to save you all. One last time. Protector of the fairies. Was there not more you wished to say? Mest asked him, the two standing before the giant golden gate. Normally the sight would have had Mest staring at him for hours, but the presence unsettled him. Even if he couldn't sense anything concrete, he could feel the pressure coming from the holy palace trying to tell him to leave. You know how Nozomi feels about you. That could have been your very last chance to respond to those feelings. What would you have done? Ichigo asked him. Saying anything, wouldn't that be too cruel if she is never able to see me again? Frowning, Mest reluctantly nodded. But dash. It's fine, Mest. I'm fine. Besides, even if I didn't say anything, I think she knows anyway. Then why not say something? Ichigo merely gave him a sad look. Because that would merely confirm her thoughts. Thoughts alone can be the owner's delusions. What one would have liked. Confirmation would turn them from what one would have liked to what could have been. I wasn't going to do that. Not even if I erased her memory. Not even then, Ichigo stated. I appreciate everything you have done for me. Both my future self and my current one. But I'm not sure I can agree with his decision any longer to play the villain. He threw away too much for a goal neither of us has ever truly fulfilled. As protectors we're failures, but at least those that I tried to save won't have something as precious as memories taken from them just so I can dull my own pain and theirs. If that is what you wish, I'll accept it, Mest stated, turning to face Ichigo before kneeling before him, much to the other's embarrassment. It's been an honor, Ichigo, to fight by your side for all these years. Even if it has only been a few months for you. Don't kneel before someone like me, Ichigo stated, pulling Mest up to his feet. I don't deserve it. I've failed so many times and dragged so many people into my own messes. I'm not someone to praise. Perhaps you see it that way. But along the way you have made so many sacrifices, and did make so many more. All for the sake of those you cared about, and you continued to protect them long after they saw you as nothing more than an enemy. I'm thanking the man who tried to suffer alone all so he could do what he needed to do to keep those he cared about safe. I'm honoring the man prepared to risk his life for every living soul on this planet. I'm not doing it for such a grand reason like that, Ichigo muttered, resting his hand against the golden metal of the doorway before him and letting his magic pulse across it. This is merely for the sake of those I care about. Because I can't stand a world where I live and they all die. No matter what I have to sacrifice, I'll make sure they all see another day. Even if I have to fight the greatest enemy of the world itself. On that note, Ichigo allowed his voice to reach his inner world, reaching out to his Daedalus self. Last chance if you wanted to find a way to separate yourself. Otherwise your fate is tied with me. What fate? His Daedalus self scoffed. I'm dead already. Might as well keep you company through this crazy plan of yours. Not like it would work without me to help anyway. Suit yourself, Ichigo muttered, turning his head slightly as he began to feel the shifting of magic in an unnatural way. It's beginning. Face is being triggered. You can tell. Mest muttered in shock. Then dash. I know, replied Ichigo, the magic in his palm spreading out and beginning to glow as it stretched out across the visible structure of the Holy Palace. Here's to hoping this works. Protector of the Fairies. He couldn't stop it. He had tried. He had tried so hard. Slip ups here and there, actions that should have made others notice, but in the end here he was, at this same day he had tried to avoid for so long. On some level he had always known this was coming. Even from a young age he had blank spots in his memory, times where he was said that he had not quite been himself. Times when he had done stuff that he hadn't always been so sure if they had been right or not. For so long things had continued this way. And for so long things had been fine. But once he joined the Magic Council, once he began to gain influence, things had changed. He would forget more and more often. His usual duties somehow finished along with unaccounted hours that he never remembered experiencing. Sometimes, when he had really been feeling brave, he had ventured out along those paths only to find nothing. And then he had begun to dream. Dream of this same sight, again and again and again. Paradise his thoughts sometimes saw it as. But most of the time they saw it as hell. Worse, a hell of his own making. He had wanted to stop it. He thought he had done so for so long. But the dreams continued, and he lost more and more time over the years. Sometimes they had even blurred together. This isn't right, he muttered, watching the pillars rising as his hacked command triggered the awakening of all of those pillars across the country. Stop this. Someone, stop this. He wished he didn't have to beg for help, but there was no one else. Within moments he found himself slipping away, a familiar sensation by now as another took certain stage to watch his masterpiece in action. To a better world, Mimi Heiji said, watching as all the pillars activated together and covered the world entirely in magical barrier particles. And as a scream of the world would cry out, he let out a smile as he began his descent to take him to the armies below. He never quite realized that the scream of the world never happened. The silence never broke, and meanwhile far away a single individual screamed out in pain in magic's place. Protector of the Fairies. The fallen god descends. It hurt. So much pain was flowing through his veins. Each breath he took made his lungs feel like they were on fire, the very magic he had to struggle to keep a hold of escaping with every passing second. He had thought he had been prepared for the moment when those pillars rose from the ground. He had been wrong. One moment he had been witness to the magical barrier particles being unleashed, the next moment he was down on all fours, choking on his own blood as the very energy unleashed targeted him with a viciousness few could match. His magical power, great enough to summon up armies of demons in a matter of minutes, found itself being exhausted to a mere fraction of its normal size. He hadn't run low on magic like this since, he wasn't even sure actual. It had been so long since he had felt this weak. And so long since he had felt this other sensation. His body hurt all over. His shoulder continued to send waves of pain through him, the blood still soaking into his clothes as it continued to refuse to heal. But as he tried to stand he couldn't shove the dizziness to one side. Was this from blood loss? He had seen it happen to others but had never experienced it himself. He felt a hand reach out to steady him but he hardly paid his helper any notice, bringing a hand up to his face before biting into his own flesh, just hard enough to draw blood. He quickly spat it out as he pulled his hand back, examining it carefully as the blood continued to flow freely from his hand. And as the seconds ticked by, it didn't stop. Mortality. A concept so foreign to him after so long. Death had long been something he had tried to achieve but he had never thought he would ever become mortal. He had assumed he would have to find some very tricky method to temporarily bypass his immortality. But this wasn't a mere loophole he was witnessing. It wasn't his immortality acting up. He could feel it, how every cell in his body, for the first time in hundreds of years, began to age once again. His constant stasis had finally ended, no longer trapping him between life and death. "Your Majesty," he heard the man next to him whisper, noticing him enough to realize it was August who had been by his side. He had hardly noticed, but he could feel that familiar presence now that his mind was beginning to focus once again. "Are you all right?" "I'm fine, August," he stated, glancing at the barrier that had sprung up around them. It was impressive work. Simple without any need for elegancy. A shield purely to blow raw damage. There was probably no better type shield to keep out the magical barrier particles trying to break through to refill the air that August had, at some point, purged of their brethren. Had the old man expended a chunk of his magical power to force the energy back long enough to form this barrier? He would like to commend the man if not for the fact the barrier would only last another few seconds. When the barrier broke, as if holes had been torn through, the pain that greeted him wasn't as bad as before. The energy was still vicious in its assault, but it was not nearly as dense as before, having spread out more to create the sight before his and August's eyes. It explained why his immortality had simply stopped working. He was not something he had ever actively controlled. His will had helped trigger its evolution, but it had always been magic at the helm, initially responding to his wishes and then rejecting his cries afterwards. So long as it had been there, he couldn't die. It wouldn't ever let him. But for the first time in all of history, magic had fallen silence. No, it wasn't even that. It simply wasn't there, at least not in the air. The world itself had fallen unnaturally quiet, his own breathing like a roaring in his ears in comparison. Looking around, he found the battlefield had quickly turned into a field of corpses. Oh, not all of them were dead he realized as he heard a groan of pain from nearby, the owner of the voice unable to hide the pain from their suffering. He understood why, feeling the same pain only much worse. The only magic left in the world was in all of them. Tiny sparks in comparison, even his own was more like a small ember compared to the firestorm that had been the world itself. But it was enough to draw the eyes of the magical barrier particles all around them. Every bit of energy they released, whether willingly or not, was devoured in seconds. Only the energy around them wasn't even satisfied with that. It could have waited them out. Without the magic in the world, they would lose more and more magic over time with no means to replace it. But instead the magical barrier particles struck out at them to hasten the process, finding what way in it could into their bodies to poison them from the insides. It wouldn't stop until they ran out of magical power, and a fool might think they could save themselves by expending what little magic they might still have right now. But that wouldn't be enough. Every individual, no matter how great or small, had a tiny spark within them. It wasn't even limited to humans. Every animal, of all shapes and sizes. Every plant, no matter what it was. Everything that lived had this spark of magic within them. It was as much a part of them as everything else, even if only a fraction learned to harness and cultivate it. It had been a part of them for so long that it was as necessary for life as breathing was for humans. That didn't matter to magical barrier particles. The smallest spark would be snuffed out, no matter how insignificant it is. Even if it means death for the one who holds it. And if this energy had truly spread all across the world, it meant the end of everything. Ha, ha ha, ha ha ha. He couldn't help but laugh, ignoring August's pointless questions as he simply gave in to his emotions. He wasn't quite sure if he was laughing out of the amusement he got from this surprise or from the sheer disbelief he had right now. He had always pictured the end of the world to come from a giant disaster. Maybe he would be the cause, maybe someone else would be. But it would be loud, noisy, massive in appearance. Not like this, so quiet and quick that you could hear a pin drop and find it all over a few moments later. Even he would only last so long in this poisoned world. If he had been able to shield himself better, he could have perhaps held out for a few days if he was extremely conservative with his remaining magical power. As it stood right now, he'd be lucky to make it last the hour. August, having already expended a good chunk of his own dwindled supply, would find it hard to last 20 minutes. This amount of time was enough though. Or it would be so long as that abomination kept his word. All he had to do was wait and, wait, hadn't he been warned about something else? No, not something. Someone. Feeling like he was being watched, he turned his gaze towards the forces of Ishgar before his eyes inevitably were drawn to the streams of magical barrier particles gathering heavily towards a single point. Eyes found his own, even at such a vast distance, and he felt a jolt of fear shoot down his spine as the man in the distance took a step forward and caused every individual around him to die, collapsing like puppets with their strings cut. Perhaps he had been correct the first time when he had thought of this being as something instead of someone. Something like this, it wasn't human. Not by a long shot. It was more akin to a monster wearing human flesh. A nightmarish creature discarding its worn-out skin as it corrupts the very world it steps foot into. And its name was known to him. There was no one else this could be. Mimi Heiji. Protector of the fairies. He was afraid. Terrified even. He could hear the sharpness of Levi's breathing as he desperately sprinted across the open plains, the men and women that once opposed him now literally stepping stones as he ignored any form of delicacy in his efforts to reach their base and the medics he hoped were there. Levi was dying. Not from any form of wound or illness but from the very air they were all breathing in. Almost all of them were in a bad state one way or another, but for some of them it was so much worse. Levi's efforts to help keep the Book of End repaired during the battle against Aknologia had helped drain her of as much strength as the rest of them, but since then her magic had been the slowest to recover, unable to be boosted by any means like most of them. And when that wave of energy hit, she had been left with what was more like drops of power, practicing slipping through her fingers every time she tried to catch them. She hadn't even been able to stay standing for a second before she was clutching at her throat, unable to even scream as she writhed in agony on the cold hard ground. His first thought had been to go to her aid, hardly able to think. It was Natsu who had pulled him out of his despair in that moment, and it wasn't for a good reason either. He had been so focused on Levi that he missed the other to fall, and in a state far worse than what he had already witnessed. Wendy had her eyes squeezed shut, but he could see the trails of blood coming down from them. Both hands were tightly pressed against her ears, as if desperately trying to block out some sound only she could hear, which left nothing to stop her screams that he really should have heard over Levi's own. They were far louder, the result of a child who had a much lower pain threshold than a woman who had trained hers to handle shattering her own bones while concealing the pain felt by it. Beyond the screams, he wasn't sure why Wendy had reacted so negatively compared to all of them. Was it because she was a sky magic user and could see magic itself? Because she had bonded with Nirvana? Because of some other unknown reason or combination of all these factors? He had quickly began to push those thoughts away when he realized that it didn't matter at all what the reason was. It was simply bad, nothing else to it. Part of him had hoped that this wouldn't have been as widespread as he knew it was. But so far they had yet to see a single sign of this site letting up. It was just as Ichigo had described. Worse perhaps because he was living through the fall of the world, not seeing the end result. But right now all they could do was run towards what felt like the source. Half his instincts were telling him to turn back, but the help Wendy and Levi needed was this way, and soon enough he was sure they would need the help too. So long as they could make it to some kind of safe zone they'd be fine for the time being. If there even was one. Hold up, he heard Jin call out, the man speeding up and placing a hand in front of him to slow him down. He complied with a frown, following the man's gaze towards the source of his attention. It was hard to make out at this distance, but the fallen bodies made it easier to see those who were still standing. One of which was right in the center of Alvarez's forces, missing an arm and guarded by another. Zeref. Looks like it, Jin muttered. August must be protecting him. It's not surprising to see they both dealt with the blast like we did. It's hard to tell at this distance, but it looks like they are ready for dash. The words Jin wanted to say fell silent when a wave of magical barrier particles seemed to rise from the ground near the front of Ishgar's forces before rushing towards Zeref and August. With a bit of quick thinking it appeared that August was already prepared, his staff being rose as his magical power rose, even as all the energy around them threatened to crush it into pieces, and unleashed a wave of pure force from his magic, causing the magical barrier particles to part around him and Zeref. Unfortunately the attack showed little intention on stopping just because it missed its target, sailing on further. Towards them. Get together! Laxus roared, hastily throwing Levi to Jin as he charged forward towards the incoming attack. His memories of taking his future self's attacks was fresh in his mind, and he could tell even at a glance that this attack surpassed everything that had been thrown at him once before. He didn't know how August had managed to split this attack with what looked like ease, but he knew his lightning couldn't do that. So the next best thing was to dampen it as much as possible. That was the intention at least, right up until Gajeel shoved his way past him, shouting out over his shoulder. "Leave this to me, Laxus." Gajeel roared, his magical power rising in challenge to the attack as he brought his arms together to form one gigantic blade. Dragon Slayer's secret art, Karma Demon, Iron God Sword. Waiting until the last moment, Gajeel swung the sword down with all his strength. Upon contact, the metal that made up his sword cracked immediately, pieces eaten away at an alarming rate until his sword was gone entirely by the time it traveled halfway through its arc, leaving Gajeel's hands to fall weakly to his sides, unresponsive to his will. It wasn't for nothing though, as the pressure from his swing was enough to force the energy before them to part like it had for August. Laxus could feel some of the energy skim against his arm as he brought it up to shield himself before it was finally over, the attack having passed them safely. "Ha, ha. I did it." Gajeel gasped out, trying to steady himself before he stumbled and fell to one knee. His arms still didn't respond to his will, so he had nothing to stop him from coughing up blood. "Shit. I'm out." Laxus was there to catch Gajeel before he could hit the ground, immediately checking on the man's pulse. He couldn't hide the sigh of relief he let out when he felt the familiar sensation of a pulse and could hear the Dragon Slayer's uneven breathing. But that blood. Gajeel had been fine mere moments ago. His arms looked like they had taken damage, but beyond that he should have been fine. No, there was something else, wasn't there? Gajeel had expended his remaining magical power. Even though he could still vaguely sense a little bit left, most of what Gajeel had managed to hold onto had been thrown into a single attack, barely enough to protect the rest of them, to spare them all from being taken down together. No. That's not possible. His head shot up, expecting to see another one of those waves from before. Instead he saw the battle beginning to wage in the distance, Zeref and August falling back as tendrils of magical barrier particles themselves rose all around them, striking them from all sides and forcing them to desperately watch each other's back to stay alive. And in the midst of all that chaos, there was a single man walking towards the two. A man as familiar as the enemies fighting for their lives. Is that Juoshiro Yukatake? Jin swore. Yeah. What is this? Was this part of his plan to stop Zeref? He never indicated he planned to go this far. Ask questions later. We need to hurry back to the camp and dash. No, we need to stop Juoshiro. Stop him. Called out Natsu. We have wounded Dash. And we have many men. As much as I really don't want to say this. We need to save Zeref. Save him. Demanded Sting from behind them, the others crowding. He's our enemy. If that guy wants to kill him, I say go ahead. Normally I'd agree, Jin stated. I'm all for taking advantage of a disadvantageous situation, but right now I cannot predict what will happen afterwards. If that is truly Juoshiro, I'm sure things will turn out fine. But if there is even a chance that it isn't, if it turns out we were being played Dash. We aren't, Laxus explained. We don't have much time for this. Short story, the chairman is the host for something else. The entity that caused all of this. Ichigo's words came flooding back to him as he realized what he had to do. Ichigo said he'd go after Zeref. He said to buy time if we could. How long has it been since the magical barrier particles hit? 3 minutes maybe? I didn't realize we were this close to Zeref, but perhaps he was hoping for this when he allowed us passage through his forces. Was it a deal he made with Ichigo? Yeah. Everyone else, head back to the others. Do what you can to help there. What about you? Asked Toshiro. Are you not coming with us? I'm needed here, Laxus explained. Ichigo said a few minutes at worst. I pray that time is right, as I doubt we can keep Mimiheiji at bay for long. All of you go. Without waiting for an answer he charged forward, using all the physical strength he could muster to sprint towards the battle ongoing. In some ways he wondered why he could still move this well when the others had obviously been struggling. Was it because of his body? Did the changes made to him biologically cause him to deal with the toxic air with more ease? Were his lungs able to filter out the poison more efficiently, or was he able to hang on to his magic a bit better because of how his body was structured now? He wished he knew, but right now all that knowledge meant was that he was the one in the best condition to actually lend a hand. He just hoped lending one didn't mean losing much more. Protector of the Fairies. What do you all hope to accomplish like this? Mimi Heiji asked, watching as another foolish soul shot out an attack to target him. The magic fizzled away before it even hit and resulted in the foolish mage's life being cut much shorter, collapsing to the ground in what looked like unimaginable pain. It could be worse. Try having your entire body ripped apart while your soul is torn away and forced into isolation. The pain of that could drive someone mad. He had gone mad a few times, and then looped right back to sanity a few centuries later. Perhaps all those attacking him were feeling a small inkling of this. That they were resorting to actions he could only see as mad because they were that desperate that nothing else made sense. It was a shame really. They could have lived a little longer if they had just stood still. Now they were simply going to become another death on his conscience. St-ASE, Beji-. He sighed as he heard the annoying static reaching his mind. Was that foolish mage still trying to reach him through that magic of his? What name was it again? Super something? Now that its purpose had been served he hadn't felt the need to remember it, but it seemed the user of it was quite tenacious. He was even managing to get a few words to him through the dense magical barrier particles that surrounded him. It spoke of his skill. Or his stubbornness. However, he knew what kind of response was being sent back. He could already imagine the bleeding body of the mage, the very connection he was managing to make causing his body to fail and for his life to be hastened to its end. And yet still the mage tried, as if it would do something. He sighed as he felt the presence of another mage, their magic rebelling against his magical barrier particles. They were such pests. Couldn't they see they were interrupting him? All he wanted to do was kill magic's precious favorite. They were enemies of Zeref too, so why couldn't they just wait patiently for him to do this? Not fast enough, he stated to the one attacking him, their attack being swung at what appeared to be slow motion to him. It was easy to move forward that extra step, allowing the blade to slice through the air harmlessly. He took notice briefly of the blade as it passed, admiring its craftsmanship. It was an impressive blade. Shame it was a magic one. Hold on, wasn't that a Zanpakuto? His head turned back slightly, just enough to take in the identity of his attacker. Juoshiro's memories supplied him with the name easily enough. Kisuke Urahara. They also reminded him to be wary, and he would admit he could understand why. For a man who had been hit by the blast of face, the Shinigami before him had a bit too much magical power. Time was still moving slowly as he shifted further away, noticing a light being fired from Kisuke's free hand. He didn't even have to act to stop it, not when a mere thought had the magical barrier particles between them hardening into a shield. It was that very reason that made his eyes widened ever so slightly when what he had expected to hold instead parted, the attack grazing his cheek as he moved his head to one side. As the light dimmed, he caught a glimpse of glass falling along the attack's path, along with a strange sort of magic. Did it interfere with his magical barrier particles in some way? It didn't appear to cancel out his power, rather it had merely repelled a small amount of it briefly. How? He had felt some of the energy in the air shift and weaken, so perhaps it had been absorbed and expelled. Someone's been messing around with my power, he muttered. He almost wanted to play a bit, to see how much this mage had learned and what kind of tricks he had. But this was bait. It was a distraction from his true prize, and so without a second thought he swung his arm out and allowed a mass of raw energy to send Kisuke flying away. As the man was thrown back, another took advantage of his arm's wide sweep. The face he saw was another to make him hesitate, a foolish thing to do in front of an enemy. But he couldn't help it. Not when the face before him was Pernida. It was a sad sight for one he had cared so much for once upon a time. A furious expression was being shown to him, but he was more focused on the eyes, ones that showed confusion as well as fury. He doubted Pernida truly understood these emotions of his. He was nothing more than a tool, constantly reborn as a pathetic attempt of magic to stop him. The old memories were irrelevant, but it was hard to remove the feelings that linger in the soul. Pernida fought him because it was his job, and yet he likely couldn't understand why he felt like he didn't want to fight him. He wished he could hold the same sentiments. But this wasn't the Pernida he knew. This was a shell. A mere doll in the image of someone he cared about, meant to play on his emotions and strike with the only energy in the world capable of doing, well, anything to him. Crushing his lingering doubts, he let Pernita's attack strike first. A hand of white energy formed, packed to the brim with energy that would crush any user of magical barrier particles. It was an inverse of his own symbol, the left hand to his right, and it meant the end to any foolish enough to tread upon territory magic had deemed forbidden. It was magic's ultimate enforcer against those that followed him. The contact with the hand burnt away his skin, trying to reach far deeper to the very core of his being. The energy around him wilted, unable to hold up at all, and to an outside it might look like this was his end. Perhaps if he had faced this power in the beginning it would have been. But if magic thought this power was enough, then they underestimated him and overestimated itself. Maybe it would have worked in a world full of magic, but this was his world now. Magical barrier particles burst out from his body and forced the power attacking him back with ease. Bit by bit it was superior, but it could do nothing against the overwhelming quantity of his own power. What was once magic's advantage was now his, and he showed great glee in crushing Pernita's power from all sides as he allowed his body to recovery, its form darkening slightly as the hair turned from its owner's snow-white color to jet black. "Now then, I think it's time to say goodbye," he stated to Pernita, crossing the gap between them before a response even left the doll's lips. Instead only blood came out, a result of him sticking his hand straight through Pernita's chest and tearing through his heart. He abandoned the body of the doll without much of a second thought, allowing every bit of it to be devoured by his power as he walked away so that no trace would be left behind. Now then, where was he another? Seriously? How many of these pests were there? Raising a hand, he caught the lightning spear with one hand and used it to throw the wielder into the path before him, not wishing to turn away from his goal any more times. "Ah, I know you," he muttered, remembering the figure from Juushiro's memories once again. "Laxistri, right? Ichigo's friend. That would be me. I thought so. But this makes things a bit more difficult," he added reluctantly, scratching his cheek as he tried to think of the best way to get rid of this problem. "Personally, I don't want to kill you myself. It's another matter if you die normally, but I think killing you will really piss Ichigo off. That's not really beneficial for me, so would you mind just moving out of the way? I have business with that so-called dark mage over there." "I'm aware," Laxus stated, raising his magical power in response rather than moving. Didn't the fool realize that would burn him out far faster? He wanted to groan in frustration at the man's stupidity. Why did everyone keep getting in his way? Why did they also do this? "So be it," he muttered. "I didn't want to kill you, but if I hold back a bit you should be fine. I think. This will be a learning experience for the two of us." With a flick of his wrist he solidified the energy around him into a spear, using it to parry the thrust of the lightning bolts flung at him as Laxus charged. The moment it became apparent that Laxus was too close for it to retain its usefulness, he lets its form disperse until he was holding a mere dagger, stepping in closer to get its full use. Laxus threw his full weight behind his fist as he swung it, but it meant nothing when he could easily dodge such a blow, raising his dagger up in the process and stabbing it down through the lightning that connected the lower half of the arm to the rest of Laxus's body. With how weak the threads had already been, he wasn't surprised to see it fall with ease, ignoring the useless piece of his opponent as he continued to press his assault to go after the other arm. Seeing his intentions, Laxus smartly retreated further back towards Zeref. It wouldn't take long for the Dark Mage to see them both and get ideas, and he really didn't want to bother with the hassle of drawing this battle out any longer than it needed to be. Better to deal with Laxus before he could unite with Zeref. Launching himself forward, he let the energy around him shape into small pellets, firing them forward with a smirk as Laxus tried to fire a blast of lightning forward to keep them at bay. It stopped a few to be sure, but there were hundreds he could make with a snap of his fingers. Losing even a tenth of them to a blast like that meant nothing when the rest continued to sail through, slamming into Laxus and causing him to let out a roar of pain. There weren't many injuries on Laxus's body, however. He had to give credit where it was due, that wasn't a result of magic. That body of his was tough even without it if he could tank that many pellets of magical barrier particles. Perhaps he should compensate by increasing their size. Or perhaps merely fire another volley. It had hurt Laxus, so he doubted that endurance could do much more than keep him fighting at the moment. No, it would take far too long. He couldn't afford to get tied into this game of cat and mouse. If he waited too long he might not get to kill Ziref. The man would die, make no mistake about that, but he wanted to do the deed himself rather than just watching it happen from a distance. Bringing an arm back, he let the magical barrier particles around him gather together, swirling into a mass of darkness now forming in the palm of his hand. And like he anticipated, Laxus responded with magic of his own. The man was summoning forth what was probably all of his remaining strength, knowing he would not win without it. It wasn't going to be much. He could tell from the scale of it. This wasn't even close to the Dragon Slayer's best. He had seen the legendary spells of this era and the man no longer had the magic for in this situation. It was merely going to be a technique with a lot of punch to it, the energy focused to target a single point and break through. The man was betting on the chance that he could overcome his magical barrier particles by focusing all his strength into piercing through. But why would that ever work? His attacks were too strong to be stopped by such simple methods. As lightning coated Laxus's remaining fist, he swung it forward with all his might, even at the cost of the rest of the lightning, which bound his body together, dimming. In turn he swung his own arm forward, the orb of darkness being flung ahead and unleashing all its power within a single blast. Lightning rose up to fight it, like light trying to break through the cracks of night. But it was useless. The magic fighting him dimmed, going out in a flash as Laxus found himself smothered by the darkness itself. He made sure to not let his power linger too long, pulling it back as he felt the magic that remained within Laxus weaken. Hopefully he'll appreciate this, Mimi Heiji muttered, glancing distastefully at Laxus's motionless body as he passed it. It's so hard to hold dash. The deafening sound of lightning erupted right behind him, his ears ringing from the noise as he spun round just in time to see the storm of lightning unleashed from the Dragon Slayer's mouth. With a wave of his hand he deflected the blast to one side, allowing it to crash harmlessly to one side as he stared at the source. This time he saw movement but there wasn't any follow-up attack. It was merely the sounds of one unable to hide their own pain. How annoying though. Making an attack look like it had all their strength behind just to try and get him to lower his guard. It wouldn't have mattered if it had hit, it had been weak enough that he could deflect it with one hand with little effort, but it was the point of it all. He felt far too rusty to have misread the amount of magic Laxus had left if he had been able to force out the last few drops into an attack like that. Or perhaps you are making us sentimental, he muttered. Sometimes you are a pain, Juushiro. Well, no matter. He just had to go finish what he... Oh, he lost focus. The tendrils he had formed to attack Ziref while he had been approaching weren't responding anymore to his will. When had they been destroyed? He was sure they had been fine a few moments ago. Was it when Laxus made his attack? That had been disorientating if nothing else. Of course the Magic King himself wouldn't miss such an opportunity. You're fast, he commented, barely able to tilt his head to spot August and Ziref. His movements were being restricted so much by the magic that bound him, holding his limbs in place while Ziref rushed ahead. How long did it take you to set this up? A few seconds? For a king without a throne anymore, you haven't lost your touch, I reckon. It was a decent enough plan that the two of them had devised. They could not win an all-out battle, so instead they had resorted to this method. With his movements bound, he would be wide open. If there was any magic that could kill him in one moment, it had to be the magic of death. As ancient as he was, he still possessed the possibility of dying. So long as that possibility existed, Ziref's magic would work. They only needed to hold him in place another few seconds for Ziref to cross that gap. Did they really think it would be that simple? He stopped his efforts to break free, allowing Ziref to reach him and lunge. A single touch of that magic would kill him. But only if that magic touched him. Moving as if he had no restraints at all, he reached out with one hand, coated in a dense fog of magical barrier particles that were leaking from his skin, and grabbed Ziref by the wrist. In the same moment that he grabbed him he began to spin, pulling Ziref off balance and taking him far enough that his other arm could come round and slam against the Dark Mage's back, slamming and pinning him against the ground. Thank you, he said gratefully to the Dark Mage, letting a wave of magical barrier particles press down over Ziref just in time to prevent the wave of death magic from leaking out from all sides of the man's body. For saving me the trouble of fetching you. Your Majesty. Quiet, he growled out, removing his hand from Ziref's wrist and lashing out with a wave of energy, reshaping it mid-flight so that it formed multiple snake heads intent on devouring the Magic King whole. Beams of raw magic flashed to life as August tried to press through, but he simply added more mass to his snakes to replace what was lost, a feat that grew easier as August's magic ran dry. If magic had still been around, he was sure August might have been a dangerous foe. There would have been no magic beyond the old man's reach. But in a world without it, August was merely that. An old man. He didn't even have to watch to hear the sound of August falling to his knees, but after Laxus's last-ditch attack he wasn't going to let his guard down easily. His power remained, ready to strike the second it sensed even a fluctuation of magical power in the air. Now then, I have to say it is not really a pleasure to meet you, Ziref, he stated, ignoring the man's response. These words may have been spoken at Ziref, but they weren't for the benefit to talking. They were just things he wanted to say. Personally, I have nothing against your actions. Your goal was one I would have supported. If you had been anyone else, I'm sure I would have offered you my aid in some form or another. Your desires would have meshed wonderfully with my hatred. But alas, from the very beginning you suffered a terrible fate. You know of which I speak of, right? Ziref stopped struggling beneath his grip, seeming like he was listening. He didn't trust that, aware that the Dark Mage would just be waiting for any opening to strike. Cursed to live, unable to even have the right to die, magic certainly does not play fair, does it? It took so much of your life out of your control that you feel the need to lash out in turn. But for all that opportunity, you never reached out for my power. Baragan did. He did so happily. So why didn't you? I know why, he added in disappointment. You feared what would come afterwards. That you would be denied a peaceful rest. That you would be unable to reunite with those you once cared for. Tired of living, and yet afraid of not being at peace in death. You are truly a contradictory human. But you need not worry anymore. You can die with all the souls in this world and find freedom from magic forever. The struggling picked up once more as he sighed. As much as I would say this is a gift, it isn't for you. Because out of all of Magic Sukin, you were its favorite. You were the one who could get away with most. You even ignored the calls to pursue your own selfish goals. Another Ukin might have fallen for that, or would have at least lost favor. But not you. Not the one magic grips onto obsessively, refusing to ever let slip from its grasp. Which is why killing you right now is going to something quite personal. Whatever magic left in the world that can still sense what is going on, I want it to watch. I want it to bear witness as I take away its most precious plaything. How to do it though? He mused over. Decapitation? Blood loss? Poison? No, I have something much better. Bringing his free hand back, he slowly reached out towards Ziref, savoring every moment of the man's fear. I'll force magical barrier particles to swarm through your body, devouring every last drop of magic left in you until you are nothing more than a husk. And I'll take my time too. Until the last drop of magic leaves this world from the bodies of those still clinging to it, I will not let you rest. You will suffer in agony, and then you will be sentenced to oblivion. Well then? He asked mockingly, not caring for what answer he got in turn. The one he heard sounded vulgar anyway. Let us begin. He paused briefly when he felt a fluctuation of magic, the snakes he had made lunging at August without him even needing to give the final command. So the Magic King had chosen to be defiant to the end, huh? A shame, but with that out of the way it was one less thing to worry about. Apologizes. I got distracted. Wasting no more time he lowered his hand towards Ziref's head, letting a grin engulf his face as he prepared to inflict as much suffering as possible on his most hated foe's favorite toy. Nothing would have made him pause at this point. But something did made his body stop. Juushiro's will momentarily taking control at the sound of another's voice. Sorry I'm late. I was wondering when you were going to show up, Ichigo, he called out, turning towards Ichigo before being thrown away by a wave of white light, his eyes widening in shock at the sheer amount of magical power that had just slammed straight into him. With a low growl he tore it apart, his hand scrapping across the ground as he forced himself to come to a halt, spotting the source of that magic standing beside Ziref's body. There was no doubt on who this was meant to be. He recognized that voice. It had been enough to jolt Juoshiro awake for a moment there. But this presence he was feeling, that power that struck him. He had actual felt pain from that attack, and the amount of magical power required for that should have drained Ichigo entirely if he had been hit by Face's blast. And looking at Ichigo right now, magic did not seem something he was short on. He was practically radiating it, the very air around him being turned into a safe zone from his own energy. "Oh Ichigo," he muttered, unable to mask the pain he felt at this sight. "You foolish child. What have you done? Protector of the fairies. A puppet's resolve. You took your time," Ziraf snarled out at him, the frustration clear to his soul eye as he glanced to the source of the voice. "What happened to getting here quickly? Another second or two and I would have been damned." Ichigo sighed. He had expected this conversation, but it was still annoying to deal with. "I thought you wanted to die. I don't like the idea of my future rest being replaced with eternal torture, thank you very much. Perhaps you should be living a better life then. Like that matters to magic. Or even you," Ziraf added as an afterthought. "So you actually went and did it? You thought I was lying?" "No, I knew you were being truthful," Ziraf stated with certainty. "I just didn't think you'd succeed. I played along on the off chance it worked. But even so, seeing this is rather irritating. It's like seeing my most hated thing and my most obsessive one mixed together. Hurry up and kill Mimi Heiji already so I don't have to deal with this sight for much longer." Yeah, he muttered, raising a hand towards Ziraf and August as a golden transparent barrier appeared around them. For extra method he made sure he could no longer hear any noise from within the barrier, and as an added measure strengthened it so that no one would be able to enter or exit. Only after he was done did he pause, wondering why he had placed so many defensive measures over it. Had he done those for the others? His gaze briefly shifted to the many golden barriers littering the landscape, far and wide, before realizing he hadn't. "Damn," he muttered. It had already begun. How long could he keep himself going in this state? He hoped it would be long enough. For the time being he let himself take comfort in the fact that he was following his own actions, snapping his fingers to move the form of nearby friend far away from here, sending Laxus to one of the nearby barriers to ensure his safety. Laxus was sure to recover quickly in there, and as it stood he had no trouble maintaining those barriers. Even with their sheer number. How many? He allowed his full attention to return to Mimi Heiji. It had never fully left, part of his senses always keeping track of where the man had been. Looking at him he could already tell there was little left of Juoshiro. Even the chairman's appearance had started giving way, and it would be only a matter of time until he was completely rewritten into Mimi Hagi's own image. "I'm sorry, I wasn't paying attention," he lied as he looked for any openings. There weren't any. Mimi Heiji looked entirely relaxed, but the state of the magical barrier particles around them both told him exactly why that was the case. This wasn't the world he knew anymore. It was Mimi Hagi's. And any who dared challenge that would find the world itself as their enemy. "What did you say?" "I asked you how many," Mimi Heiji repeated. "Those golden barriers you've thrown up. Just nearby I could at least 30, all of various sizes. But you could have gotten back here within a second or two. Am I wrong?" Ichigo didn't give him an answer, but he might as well have done with all his silence did. Minutes passed. Precious minutes that you could have appeared here, and yet you delayed. Why? Because even with all that power I feel escaping you, you still needed a bit of time. Would I be right in assuming that there are thousands of these barriers all over the world? Or is that still too small? I could have just taken my time. No. With that kind of power, I know what you'd want to do. Right now, the strength you have matches those of gods. No, it surpasses them. With all that power, the temptation to fall back on your most base desire would be too much. Saving a few wasn't good enough. Nor was saving a lot. You wanted to save as many as possible, to prevent as few from dying from the changed world as possible. What's wrong with that? What's wrong? Mimi Heiji sighed, sounding disappointed that he had to explain this to him. You're giving them false hope, Ichigo. You've let them believe that this world will be resisted. But can't you see? It's already too late for that. This is the start of a new age, One free from the burdens of the past. One free from the tyranny of magic, a force far crueler than any corrupt king or malevolent demon. These barriers will fade in due time, and they will all be forced to suffer all the move from it. And besides, Mimi Heiji added, a snarl crossing his face as the magical barrier particles around them both solidified into thousands upon thousands of arrows. Can you really afford to waste the strength needed to maintain all those barriers while also fighting me? The arrows launched, but Ichigo didn't move from his stop. Instead, only a snap was heard before all of the projectiles fell against a pure white barrier, cracking under the strain of each shot but being repaired just as quickly as it accumulated damage. I think I'll be fine, he stated as the last of the arrows shattered against the barrier, allowing it to fade away now that its purpose was finished. Consider this your handicap if you want. It may hurt your pride, but I have no intention of fighting you while giving up on the lives of everyone else. I didn't go this far merely to win back a soulless world. No, that's right. Of course it is, Mimi Heiji muttered. It's simply not in your nature. But so is this too. Winning back a soulless world is undesired. That is what cemented your resolve. And your willingness to turn yourself into that thing's puppet. I wasn't sure what to think when I saw you, Ichigo, but now I realize. I pity you. Pity me all you want, I don't get. Even hate me if you want. I plan to crush your dream after all. Indeed. This is such a shame. Neither moved a muscle for a moment, waiting for the other to make the first move. Then a snap was heard, and the world around them was engulfed in a clash of light and darkness. Protector of the fairies. She could breathe again. Gasping for the previous air, Levi managed to take in her first breath of non-toxic air in what had felt like an eternity. Her body still felt like it was on fire, pain firing through all synapses, but for once breathing wasn't the source of that anymore. What little magic that was left in her body fought back against the rest of her source of pain, but all that poison within her vanished far quicker than she had even expected, as if another had given her a helping hand. Take it easy, she heard someone say. The voice was familiar, her eyes straining to see as she forced them open. This entire scenario seemed familiar to her, the voice slowly becoming recognizable as she realized why. Ah, good, stated Kisuk as she slowly pushed herself up, not trying to struggle to get into anything more than a sitting position. You recovered faster than I expected. Where am I? Her eyes glanced around briefly, seeing dozens of others in a similar position to what she had been in. Not all of them were moving. Did we make it back? Where's Laxus? And the others? Her eyes began to widen as she noticed a familiar head of blue hair in the corner of her vision, her gaze being torn to one side, desperately hoping she was wrong. She wasn't. Wendy. And as quickly as she noticed the figure of the youngest dragon slayer, she noticed one of the oldest lying one body over. Gajeel. Relax, Kisuk said, pressing down on her shoulder with one hand to stop her from trying to make any rash movements. You're still weak. But there. She paused, slowly noticing the slow but constant signs of their chests moving up and down. See, said Kisuk, his eyes keeping watch on her. They're alive. It was close for all of you, in particular these two. Wendy had a pretty bad reaction to the changed world while Gajeel emptied almost all his magic in one go to protect you lot when you were almost here. We almost did lose him, but whether through luck or sheer force of will he managed to hold on long enough for a miracle. Thank you. Kisuk paused, giving her an odd look briefly before his eyes seemed to soften in disappointment. Ah. You thought. No, that's not quite right. I did nothing. I could do nothing, in fact. None of us could. She frowned, glancing back towards Wendy and Gajeel briefly before returning her gaze to him. But you said that Gajeel survived for a miracle. Kisuk chuckled, but it had little of his usual amusement in it. It was too forced, as if he was trying to pretend to block something else out. I know I have performed some feats you might think miraculous, but they aren't. They're just merely works of my own intelligence and skill, polished and refined over many long years of both great and terrible deeds. But this wasn't anything within my power. This wasn't within anyone's power. She still didn't understand. As he made to stand, she quickly reached out to grab him, half regretting the action when her hastiness made her head spin. She didn't let go thought, knowing he'd leave without giving her any answers if she did. It was easy enough for him to break free though. Or it should have been. But for some reason he didn't do that. He merely stayed where he was, hesitating for a moment whether he should do something or not. You asked where Laxus was, right? He asked hesitantly, her heart almost stopping at his words. What's happened to him? She asked, her grip on his hand becoming desperate as she tried to force herself to her feet. No sooner had she done so did she feel her bad leg weaken beneath her, almost causing her to crash to the ground again if not for the timely intervention from Kisuk himself. Laxus, he hasn't dash. Laxus is alive, interrupted Kisuk, much to her own relief. I'll take you to him. You'll get some answers this way. I would have no right this information from you of all people. She didn't understand what he was talking about yet, but she wasn't willing to let go of this chance. He quickly adjusted his stance so she could stand beside him, one arm clinging to his arm still while he did his best to try and support her in turn. You would have collapsed as soon as it happened, I assume. When the world was engulfed in magical barrier particles. I think I remember that, she admitted. It was hazy though. I could hard tell what was happening. And after a while, nothing. I'm surprised you remember anything really. We've had a few others wake up already who remembered nothing at all. In some cases, I think they even remembered less than they should have of their own lives. It's better than death though. I lost track of how many already died. Kisuk shook his head slightly, as if trying to push those thoughts away as they walked. The one responsible was Mimi Heiji. That was what little I was able to learn from Hibiki when he contacted me. I haven't heard from him much since. I hope he's still alive, but he was using a lot of magic extremely recklessly. From what he told me at least dash. I know about Mimi Heiji, she threw in quickly, ignoring the surprise on his face that quickly morphed to realization. Ah. Ichigo told you, I assume. Yeah. Must have told Hibiki too. He didn't tell you. Unfortunately not, though it has been hard to question him on why. Regardless, I tried to go out and stop Mimi Heiji. I had hoped to strike when he was still reliant on his current host's body. I thought I had him, but I miscalculated. Miscalculated both my own strength and his. The gap was too wide and I ended up flung back here, unable to stop him. At that time he was heading over to Zeref, likely to kill him, I assume. That's fine and all, but you said the world was engulfed in magical barrier particles, right? I did. Levi frowned, looking up at what she could not mistake as a golden barrier near where they were approaching. It wasn't solid like the one she was used to staring at, the inside curves of Fairy Sphere a long familiar sight by this point, and instead looked like they could very well pass through it if they wished. But there was no denying that it was keeping something out. There was a reason the air in here felt so pleasant. Why it didn't hurt to breathe. Why she had even been able to wake up in the first place. Is this the miracle you spoke of? Kisuk followed her gaze, his eyes flashing in pain ever so slightly. Some would. You already realized it, correct? This is a safe zone. Free from magical barrier particles. Yes. And it isn't the only one too. I've been to the edges of this barrier and seen others in the distance. Some large, some small, but there are dozens of these scattered across the landscape. They look like Fairy Sphere but without a physical shell. I know. Kisuk muttered quietly. There's a reason for that. But how are they even holding up against all the magical barrier particles outside of the barrier? She asked, noticing how frequently small ripples would brush against the barrier's surface now that she was nearer the boundary. With how much magical barrier particles are out there, it would take an enormous amount of magical power to maintain it. I doubt they are being attacked as much as you think. These barriers would hardly hold up under a focused assault of magical barrier particles, guided by a wielder's will. Passively the barrier is just strong enough to keep them at bay, but to create a safe zone it also meant purging all the foreign energy within them. The barriers expanded from the center and pushed back or destroyed any magical barrier particles in their way. That alone would take a lot of magical power, but to do this for the dozens of safe zones that we can see? And for the more almost certainly out of sight? Forget enormous. The magical power required for this is beyond any human. Beyond any god even. This feat should be impossible. Despite that impossibility, it still happened. She heard another call out, noticing Laxus standing near the edge as they approached. He didn't turn to greet her, his gaze locked on something beyond the barrier's edge. He almost looked like he was having to hold himself back from taking a step forward. It's miraculous. Not, it's not, Laxus spat out, causing Levi to notice his hands were tightened as fists. This might be a miracle for us, but I'm not a fool. For this miracle, there will be a price. And I'm looking at that price right now. And the one who has decided to pay that price. She froze, the pieces slowly coming together. Kisuk's acceptance at bringing her head, her right to know what was happening and see this, the familiarity of the barriers itself, Laxus's own frustration at merely watching, and finally the words and actions she remembered from the last encounter she had with Ichigo. He had wasted time preparing for this by visiting them. He had come to an answer long before they talked, and they had known then that his mind was made up. That there was only one way to stop Mimi Heiji that he had been able to come up with. And even if neither had dared speak it out loud, both she and Laxus had known what the worst case might entail. They knew this because they knew him. They knew the lengths he would go to. Closing the last few steps, she leaned on Laxus for support as she joined him in gazing at the sight in the distance. Her eyes weren't as good as his, but she could help that. It was wasteful to use, but she felt she had just enough magic to make this sacrifice, forming words to help enhance her vision to see the sight too far away for her eyes to make out much detail normally. You could have asked for some of these, Kisuk told her, pulling out a small object that quickly unraveled itself into a pair of binoculars. I always keep one or two on me for when I need to scout out an enemy's position. Would save you the magic. I'm fine, she muttered. She wasn't, this took a lot of focus, but she wanted to do this under her own power. Her vision slowly come into focus on the sight in the distance, and even then she almost lost sight of what was going on, the two individuals clashing so fast that looked like two blurs to her. A clash of darkness that seemed to overwhelm everything, and a single bit of light that wouldn't dim no matter how much was thrown against it. But when they stopped for a few moments, her eyes find themselves focusing on only one of them. With hair as bright orange as normal, she almost thought Ichigo looked the same as always. But then his head shifted slightly and she saw his eye. She almost lost herself staring at it, a sense of unease rushing down her spine. It appeared to look directly at her. That wasn't the eye of a mortal. That wasn't a human's eye, and while she hadn't met a god, she would be hard-pressed to say if it was like theirs too. There was something alien about that gaze. Like she was staring into an abyss, just as frightening as the monster Ichigo was facing. And then he raised his hand slightly. It was a tiny motion, his hand tilting slightly as if giving a tiny wave. But it was enough to snap her out of her trance, noticing the small smirk on his face. Was he looking at her? At this distance? In the middle of this battle? How had he even noticed her? She lost trace of him once again as he started to move, but the memory of his appearance still consumed her mind. Each time he paused she could see it again, the differences beyond that eye that showed in his appearance. Golden light stretched across all visible parts of his body, following every pathway magic followed, and even those that it didn't. His veins themselves shone with the same intensity as the rest, and she would be a fool to not notice the small cracks on his face beneath his lone eye, golden light shining at a greater intensity there than anywhere else on his body. Looking carefully too, she could tell that his hair wasn't merely orange. There were a few strands that shone with the same color that was scattered across his body, golden sections that had hung down one side over where his empty eye socket would be. As she saw Ichigo clash once more, with who could only be Mimi Heiji, her vision turned dark briefly before she found herself staring through her unenhanced eyes once again. Huh. Figured it wouldn't last, Kisuk said, not even looking away from the sight himself and merely reaching into his pockets to pass her an identical set of binoculars to the ones he was using. Here. Pride won't do you much good if you want to watch this. Not when you're this low on magical power. She reluctantly took them, glancing at Laxus for a moment as he continued to watch the battle in the distance. You don't need these two. It's difficult to follow, but my eyes can just about make it out, he muttered gruffly. Perks of having dragon eyes, I reckon. They're adapted to see further than my old eyes. Is that so? She wondered what it was even like, having eyes that were new and all, but another question weighed down on her too heavily to ignore. It was something that bothered her, and had done since she had first laid eyes on Ichigo just now. "Can you sense Ichigo's magical power?" "No," Laxus grunted after a brief bit of hesitation. "Same. But these barriers, and that magical power from over there. That's coming from him, right?" "It is," Kisuk confirmed for her from the side. "There's no doubt that Ichigo is the one giving off this magical power. But that's..." She wasn't sure at first how to describe it. But she knew one thing for certain. "That's not his. I know his. I'm too familiar with it to not, and it was never this vast even at his peak. It's like an ocean with no end," Kisuk muttered. "Like an open sky with the horizon stretching out far and wide. It's not got the quality of a human but rather the radiance of something more. Something ancient and yet so very crucial to the world itself. Something primordial, from days of old. Something that was always once around us so we never noticed just how vast it could truly be." Kisuk sighed, lowered his binoculars and shaking his head. "It's the reason we still can live for a bit longer right now. The reason why all our hopes and dreams didn't just end when Mimi Heiji unleashed his destruction upon the world. At the moment that should have been his victory, someone intervened. Took what was all around us and should have been destroyed and hid it away. And is still hiding it away. What you are sensing is the magic of the world itself, not Ichigo. And that worries me." She didn't want to ask but she found the question escaping her lips before she could stop it. "Why?" "Because I'm not sure which is the truth here," Kisuk admitted. "Is Ichigo harnessing the magic of the world? Or is the magic of the world harnessing him? Protector of the fairies." His head was spinning. 1,000 different possibilities flowed through his mind, all possible options for what he could do at this moment. With the same motion that he needed for any of them, he flicked his wrist to bring his hand up, unleashing a force of wind harsh enough to blow away the dark energy racing towards him. For a moment he allowed the winds to rage on like a hurricane, a force of nature far outside the control of men. And with another small gesture he seized control of each bit of that force and brought it together, compressing it down until it was thin enough to be gripped within his hand, its length only slightly longer than he was tall. Mimi Heiji closed in the moments those winds finished compressing, the outside force that had prevented his approach also serving to hide it as it shrank. He was sure a similar number of choices of what to do had run through that fallen god's head in this moment, but in the end the one chosen was quite similar to the one he had taken. Whereas he had generated the wind and compressed it down, Mimi Heiji replaced the first step by merely willing the energy around them to come to him. The weapon formed faster than his own had, but that was the advantage of having the world on your side. By the time the gap between them shrunk to only a few meters, both had an identical weapon in their hands. They weren't anything fancy. Their shape was nothing elegant. In Mimi Hagi's case, there was little need for a proper point to the spear. Its surface was deadly no matter what part of it hit, to the point it didn't need to wound. Only touch. In his case, he was holding a storm within his hands. Beneath the surface of tightly held wind raged the full force of a natural phenomenon. Like Mimi Heiji, it would not matter how his weapon struck. If it even brushed skin, it would rip the flesh away from the body in seconds. If it was thrust into them, it would tear apart their insides as it passed through. For both of them, the other's weapon could easily mean instant death. And yet despite it all, as their two weapons clashed, they found neither was able to gain the ground they needed. Both weapons could only chip away at the others, the damage superficial and easily fixed. The times he was sure he would hit, Mimi Heiji dodged with the same unnatural ease as before. When strikes came close to hitting him in turn, he easily outpaced the strike to let it pass by him narrowly, only moving enough to avoid so as to not retreat in this clash. He was sure Mimi Heiji realized they were getting nowhere fighting like this. It was not the first time this had happened. Time and time again they continued to clash, and each time they ended up clashing in a similar way. It wasn't that they were thinking the same though. Every time he attacked one way, Mimi Heiji purposefully chose to retaliate in an identical fashion. Was it pride that motivated Mimi Heiji currently? Did the idea that he could be outmatched in any field by magic bother him that much? Did he not want to lose to magic in anything currently? The worrying part was that despite the way Mimi Heiji was acting, it wasn't hindering him. He could only now understand just how long Mimi Heiji had truly existed for, the knowledge that was not his own flowing through his head to tell him just how long ago that battle had once been. Even in isolation, this man had trained. Even in madness, this god had planned. Never once resting, awaiting this day for an eternity so that he would be the one victorious. He could understand now why Mimi Heiji had been able to defeat him so easily before in the future. Why Mimi Heiji had been able to kill the others with ease. It wasn't just power. It was experience. Experience honed for this singular purpose. Even with the strength he had right now, if he had been merely wielding the strength he had before, he would have lost. He was sure of it. However, right now it was different. He had never used a spear much. He'd held them and given them a few swings, but he had fought with a sword. All he knew about them was how to defeat them. But despite all that, he attacked with the skill of master after master, the knowledge of some of the greatest warriors of such weapons guiding his body and passing on their skill, even if just briefly, while he fought. In experience he might have been lacking alone, unable to cover anywhere close to as much that Mimi Heiji had. But if there was something he did not know, there was always someone who did. Someone better than him who could lend that hand. There was one advantage in this clash though went to him. Mimi Heiji was choosing his attacks as if trying to beat magic at its own game. He had no such cares when it came to magical barrier particles. As he thrust forward with the spear once more, Mimi Heiji began to dodge. The weapon passed by the man's side, his sudden strike leaving him exposed to retaliation. A perfect chance for a counter-attack to take place due to his hastiness. Except that strike never came as he expected. Instead, Mimi Heiji realized too quickly what he had been planning, recognizing the opening for the trap it was. He began to pull back but still misunderstood just what kind of trap it had been. He'd hoped for Mimi Heiji to get closer, but he'd settle for even a glancing hit at this moment. The tight control he had kept on the winds vanished, and without that leash on them the force of nature that had been restrained exploded back to full size, tearing apart the ground they stood on and stretching off in all directions, leaving a single safe spot in a horizontal line that he stood within. The second he saw the familiar condensed shape of magical barrier particles within the wind, however, he knew that the remains of this attack were more trouble to him than they were to Mimi Heiji. With a snap of his fingers the air quieted, coming to a complete half to allow him to see the whip-like strike of magical barrier particles reaching out towards his body. With a quick kick off the ground he sailed over the strike, debating whether to retaliate for a second as he picked up on Mimi Heiji's location. Despite the forces that had torn the ground apart, the damage merely another mark on the landscape from their battle so far, Mimi Heiji had held his ground almost completely. He was merely a few feet away from where he had initially been when the winds hit, the hardened barrier made from magical barrier particles slowly dispersing to reveal the man behind it. There wasn't even a scratch on him, nor a tear in his clothes. He'd be hard-pressed to tell if even a hair was out of place on the man's head. Ichigo. This is truly painful to watch. So Mimi Heiji was trying to talk again. At times he did this to distract him. Other times it was because he was that confident that he could afford to stop the fight. The hard part was telling which of these it was. His single eye scanned the battlefield before him while his other senses covered the rest, allowing him to keep his attention on where Mimi Heiji was at all times. At first glance it certainly looked like Mimi Heiji was defenseless, even the magical barrier particles that had been condensed to defend him now no longer shaped. That was a mistake he knew not to make. The time it took him to strike was enough time for Mimi Heiji to act. And while his sight might not pick up everything, he could sense more. The magic within him in particular could notice the most. There were patches all around them that had a higher concentration of foulness that could only be magical barrier particles. With but a thought Mimi Heiji could finish the job. So it was the latter this time. It made it harder to strike at times like this. Especially when he couldn't afford to waste time. I thought you wanted to kill me now. Is talking really going to help you with that? Not really, Mimi Heiji admitted. But then this is the last time I will be able to hear your voice. Call me sentimental, but there's a part of me wishing there was another way. A shame there isn't. Your fate was sealed the moment you became the host for magic. Finally. Mimi Heiji was outright stating it. He had hoped the man hadn't fully realized, but the disappointment that was spoken told him exactly how sure Mimi Heiji was in that belief. There wouldn't have been any point in denying it even if he could. What does bother me is the method and the result, however, Mimi-Heiji added. The result is more irritating, but the method? I'll admit to being a bit curious to how you did it. Would you mind enlightening me? He didn't want to. It would be wasting precious time. But he needed an opening. If things continued at their current rate, they would remain evenly matched, and that would only favor Mimi-Heiji in the long run. So he'd play Mimi-Hagi's game for now. His words merely needed to make Mimi-Heiji lose focus for just a moment, either through sentiment, pity, or blind rage. "I'm pretty good at absorbing things," he admitted, deciding to play it safe with information to start with. "And I already had the timing down for when Face would activate." The problem was merely that magic would be wiped out, leaving most with no way to fight back and the few who could with no real weapons to do so in the long run. But even if the energy around us was exhausted and destroyed, it would be fine if the source remained. So long as it did, the full force of magic would remain, even if constrained to a single human. "Ah, so that's how," Mimi-Heiji muttered in interest. "Though under normal circumstances, the source of power you're drawing on should have been much lower. You would not be able to protect it all within your body, not when Face would be targeting it more viciously than anything else. How did you keep it safe during their activation? Unless..." There. It lasted for a split second, but he didn't miss it, the fury on Mimi-Hagi's face blinding him to everything else. He moved, relying on a tried-and-true technique of pumping his body full of magical power until his bones would shatter from just moving an inch. He instead crossed the entire distance between the two, an image of himself still left behind as he swung a fist, breaking as it traveled through the air. As fast as it was breaking, though, it healed just as quickly. Mimi-Heiji was left no time at all to react when the fist slammed straight into his chest. Mimi-Heiji should have been thrown away. That was how this was meant to go down in that moment. The force of his attack should have sent him flying, and yet Mimi-Heiji stood there like he hadn't even felt the punch connect. "You're truly easy to fool, Ichigo. Though I'll admit I doubt anyone else would have been able to even attack in that kind of opening. If caught unprepared, I think my chest would have collapsed from a blow like that." Not wanting to give Mimi-Heiji time to try the same stunt, he lashed out with his knee, hoping to create a bit of space between the two of them without fear of Mimi-Heiji chasing him down. He wasn't moving nearly as fast this time, but he still didn't expect for Mimi-Heiji to catch the blow with one hand and hold him in place. This time it was his turn to defend when Mimi-Heiji pulled him closer and slammed his other hand forward, a fist coated with magical barrier particles slamming into his neck. At the same time he felt the grip on his knee get released and he backed away instantly, the damage taken quickly being undone as the magic within him got to work at purging the magical barrier particles. As painful as being punched in the throat was, though, he was glad Mimi-Heiji had done that. It revealed something he had been unsure of for some time now. Stagnation. That's your ability, isn't it? You looked me up. I would have if I had the time, he admitted. Unfortunately, information on you is pretty scarce. Your work, I'd assume. But I can find fragments if I know what I'm looking for. I just needed the hint, so thanks for that. It explained a bit why Mimi-Heiji was so adept at dodging attacks that should have been moving fast enough to connect. Mimi-Heiji wasn't physically strong or fast. Even in this world where he had more energy than he would ever know what to do with, he was still slower and weaker than he was when he enhanced his body to its limit with magic. He could move fast enough and strike hard enough that a single punch might be able to shatter a mountain, and yet the moment he struck Mimi-Heiji, all that force was reduced to nothing at the time of impact. Because that was the one power that belonged to Mimi-Heiji that he could still use. The power he had once made his own, and had remained even after he had turned against magic. Stagnation brought all things to a halt, preventing them from progressing further, and that could be good and bad. Mimi-Hagi's own power became affected so that even the rejection of magic didn't cause his use of it to vanish, even if the energy source changed. That same power had been slowing not just him but the entire world down. Only Mimi-Heiji had been able to move freely. But there was a limit. If Mimi-Heiji couldn't outright hold him in place, it meant he was able to move fast enough that Mimi-Heiji could only use that power to dodge his blows. But despite that, he hadn't needed to. Its true worth had only emerged when struck with all that force. His fist that traveled forward but at some point before making contact the force itself had been lost, unable to continue the full journey with him. Would it affect magical attacks too? No, that probably wasn't the case. If it was, Mimi-Heiji would have already been able to kill him merely by walking towards him and ignoring every attack sent his way. The speed of his strikes might be slowed down, but the force itself would likely remain if it did hit. At least he hoped that was the case, but if Mimi-Heiji had been beaten once before, it was likely it was. However, he could see why Mimi-Heiji had so little to fear right now. Physical attacks would be rendered useless in actual dealing damage, and his magical ones were having to fight with magical barrier particles every step of the way. You truly are foolish, you know. He frowned, breaking away from his thoughts to listen clearly. I'm sorry for going this far. You understand, right, that you're being used, don't you? You're a tool so that magic may live. That's all this strength amounts to. And even thought it should be grateful. We both know what it is doing to you right now. Rather than praising you or thanking you, it's lashing out. It doesn't want to be chained. And so until you free it, you have to obey. Otherwise, well, perhaps it is better to show you. Raising a hand to one side, Mimi-Heiji caused the darkness around them to spiral towards him, the energy being forced down into a tiny orb no bigger than a finger in diameter. Moving to intercept, Ichigo already had a feeling it would be too late. Too much energy had already been compressed down, and the smirk on his enemy's face said it all. As Mimi-Heiji brought his hand forward, the orb being propelled with it and almost shattering from just that movement alone, he decided to instead dodge. One foot quickly kicked off the ground as the energy began to spiral out of control, the first sights of magical barrier particles being unleashed in a massive beam he would surely struggle to stop. But he wouldn't have to. He would be cleanly out of the way. Everything seemed to slow down around him as his eye continued to see the smirk on Mimi-Hagi's face, undeterred by his lack of target. Was he not the target? Where was the beam being fired at? One of his barriers? Wasn't that the one with Ziraf in? Should he move? And one moment he was watching the sight unfold, the next he was in front of the barrier itself, one hand outstretched towards the attack as it slammed into him. He quickly found the flesh on his fingers being ripped away, quickly followed by the muscles and bones. The attack still didn't stop, eating away at more of his arm until he lost the one thing holding the arm back and found the energy slamming straight into his chest and out the other side. What little energy was left after such an attack hit the barrier, but it quickly fizzled out, the additional strength granted to the barrier more than enough to help it weather the latest assault. And all Ichigo could do in this moment was feel the emptiness in his chest, moving a body without a heartbeat as he tried to understand when on earth he had even made the decision to move. You see, Mimi-Heiji stated as he approached, waving a hand in exasperation at the sight he was witnessing. He couldn't blame the man for that either. He himself found his actions foolish, the hole through his chest where his heart had been slowly closing as the magical barrier particles that polluted his body were purged. This is why I called you foolish. Just now, what thought came to your mind when you decided to save Ziraf? Was it, I will save him? Or was it, should I save him? Does it matter? Mimi-Heiji gestured towards him, a look of disappointment on his face. You tell me. This man has tried to kill you countless times before. He's gone to great extremes in the past to try and break you. While you went to try and stop what you thought was my arrival in the first timeline, he decided to continue this war. He was doing so in this second timeline until you got him to stop, but if you hadn't, you would have found the population of Magnolia slaughtered and their bodies hung up to greet you on your return. Perhaps your friends would have been up there too, or perhaps they would have been turned into dolls to fight you for his own amusement. For as long as you two have known one another, he has hated your very existence. He was even willing to abandon some of his effort on the war just to try and break your mind if he could. That man is not a saint. He's not even a good man. And you saved him without hesitation. If this was anyone else, this question wouldn't even matter, Mimi-Heiji admitted. That's one of your greatest flaws, really. You try to protect too much. You can't stand the sight of someone being killed in front of your eyes. I don't think you have ever been able to let go of your mother's death, and so you try to prevent any others to this day, your efforts only growing with each failure. But you aren't someone who can't make a distinction between those he can protect and those he shouldn't. Ziraf is your enemy. You know that, and I don't think you disagree with it even slightly. He's done far too much harm to be worthy of your protection. But the moment I targeted him you leapt in front of the attack, even though it required risking your own life. So which was it? Asked Mimi Heiji once again. For what reason did you save him? What thought crossed your mind in that moment? Should I save him? Ichigo growled out. I asked myself whether I should. Why I need to. And yet you still leapt in front of that attack instantly, stated Mimi Heiji in disappointment. It's only become clearer now just how corrupted you have been. Your mind hesitated, but your body still moved. Those weren't your instincts that moved you, were they? Who exactly ordered you to protect Ziraf in that moment with your life? Don't want to say it. Mimi Heiji sighed, shaking his head. This is why you are so foolish. You must be able to understand it. You could have sent Ziraf away when the fight started. You did the same to get your friends who were too close to safety. But you kept Ziraf nearby. Did you determine he was safer with you? Even in this situation? Why did his safety even matter? It shouldn't to you, but if it was magic that desired it. You understand, right? What I'm getting at. I don't need you to spell it out for me, Ichigo growled out. I understand fine. He truly did. He had hesitated when it came to saving Ziraf. But in that brief moment where he would have remained still, the presence of another had overwhelmed him entirely and he had obeyed its will without realizing what he was doing until it was too late. In that moment, it had almost been like he was watching the whole scene unfold. If that is the case, you can understand why I'm so disappointed at this outcome. I had no intention of killing you, Ichigo. But now I no longer have a choice. Killing you would be a mercy, to free you from the foolish burden that you were forced to bear. Because right now, you aren't a hero. Nor are you a protector. Nor a savior, nor a soldier, nor even a man simply trying to help. You aren't even a slave. What you are is nothing more than a puppet on some very thin strings, unable to realize the free will he thinks he has is so easily take away at the discretion of its master. And Mimi Heiji paused, looking at him in confusion briefly. Did you not hear what I said? Your dash. I heard you. And he asked again, taking a step forward. His body was moving how he wanted it to again, but there was still a pain he couldn't ignore, growing by the second. He couldn't let it show. Not yet. Not ever if possible. Was all of that meant to dishearten me? Make me stop? Make me break? Because Ziraf's efforts were far more difficult to deal with. And Baragan's actual succeeded. This isn't about breaking you, Mimi Heiji responded, sounding almost desperate. Why can't you see it? Your dash. A puppet, I know, Ichigo replied, cutting off Mimi Heiji before he could waste any more of his time with this. He couldn't afford it. So what? If I can beat you, does it matter? If I can keep everyone here alive, does it matter? Does it matter? Do you even understand what you're fighting for here? The goal you're aiming for, that won't include you. And? I told you, it doesn't matter. Because if I don't do this, everything will end anyway. He charged forward, Mimi Heiji reacting to him slower than normal. Was it because of his own words? Had he managed to throw Mimi Heiji off? Or was it another fake out? He supposed it didn't matter. It wasn't a chance he could turn down. The distance between them closed in the blink of an eye, his body coating with magical power as he swung a fist forward. It did nothing when it connected. The magic coating, it was another matter. Even if it was meant to have most of its force from physical power, expelling the energy as raw power was enough to launch Mimi Heiji upwards. And as quickly as Mimi Heiji was flung upwards, he followed after. He didn't bother trying to find a way to overpower Mimi Heiji with skill or technique this time. He just focused on sheer power. With a snap of his fingers, he had a sea of flames held above him in the sky. With another snap it fell down like rain, a massive shield of magical barrier particles quickly rising to protect Mimi Heiji from all harm. So he immediately switched tactics, and with another snap the flames become dense chunks of iron. Each blow hammered against the shield, weakening it until he saw an opening. Another snap and lightning fell, hitting the weakest point of the barrier and shattered it like glass. He was through the hole in seconds, dodging a wave of Mimihagi's power narrowly before snapping his fingers once more. From down below the ground rose, barreling towards them both like a missile. With a wave of Mimihagi's hand that earth came to a stop, its speed brought down to nothing. But then he hadn't expected it to work. It wasn't nearly as fast as he was. He had just needed to force Mimihagi's hand, the man quickly trying to dart back to the side to escape his barrier through the side. Another snap filled the air and a jet of water crossed the air after Mimihagi, the man quickly forming a barrier of magical barrier particles in a similar fashion. The two attacks collided and for a moment appeared to be that neither side was giving any ground. Then another snap was heard and the water was turned to ice, freezing solid and being shattered as Mimihagi's own attack tore through it. Another snap and all the broken pieces, scattered by the force of the attack, heated up into steam, burning Mimihagi as he forced himself to flee backwards. He was there waiting for him when Mimihagi broke out. Teleporting was difficult in the world Mimihagi had made, but if he used enough magic it was still possible to force the spell through. And because of that he was right beside Mimihagi, one hand grabbing Mimihagi by the wrist as his other flung towards the man's head, magic react to act the second he made contact. His grip on Mimihagi suddenly weakened entirely and his swing hit thin air as Mimihagi backed away, obviously wary of whatever he had tried to do. But he hardly had time to think about that. Not when he knew that Mimihagi hadn't broken free of his grip by a surprise burst of strength. No, the source of that lucky break for Mimihagi was the metal that had broken out of his wrist, tearing through tendons and causing him to lose any control or strength within that hand. Blood trickled down his chin as he felt the pain from before finally becoming too much to bear. This was agony. Unbearably agony, but it was only now that Mimihagi was able to see it, now that he couldn't suppress it any further. He let out a scream, doing all he could to try and stop the pain as his body spasmed out of control, pieces of golden metal breaking out of his flesh as if something within was trying to tear its way free. Another snap was heard, and finally the screams stopped. But the pain dulled. It never had from the start. Protector of the fairies. Time running out. He was still alive. The fact that was the case shouldn't have been much of a surprise to him. What he had done should have always worked. It was the kind of miracle he could pull off currently. So the fact the metal that had broken through his skin had vanished, pulled back into his body as his wounds knitted themselves back together, and the fact he was now able to silence his voice and hide the rest of the pain should not have been hard to believe. It still shocked him. He could have been wrong. The magic could not have worked. 1,000 different things could have gone differently to what he had envisioned. He had gotten lucky that this whole crazy idea had even worked. But what else could he have done? This all stemmed from the decision to take magic into himself. Everything else from this point was a mass gamble to stave off the inevitable. But for right now he had time once again, so he would be thankful for that for as long as it was able to last. So that's it, huh? Your limit. Ichigo looked up, finding Mimihagi staring down at him from a distance. The man's stance seemed more relaxed than before. If he moved now he was sure Mimihagi would act in kind, but despite what must have been a big opening Mimihagi had not made a single move. And the answer was obvious to him. Mimihagi knew. I wondered how long it would take, Mimihagi continued, a sigh leaving his lips before he pressed a hand against his head in frustration. Why couldn't you have chosen anything else? Why did you have to take such a foolish action to try and stop me? Anything but this. There was no other way to defeat you. There is no way to defeat me, period. Mimihagi exclaimed, throwing his hand forward in emphasis. Look at you. You were about to die, a result of your own foolishness and the selfishness of the very thing you are trying to protect. It was about to kill you, Ichigo, and it won't even care that it did that. It won't say thank you very much for keeping it safe for a while longer. No, all it thinks is, let go, set me free, who are you to restrain me, dot. Lowering his hand, Mimihagi shook his head in disgust. And now look at you. The wood is bending, puppet. Your strings are snapping. You can keep trying to repair the damage for as long as you want, but you aren't replacing the damaged pieces. You're sticking them back together and hoping they hold for a bit longer. Whether it be now, a few minutes from now, or an hour down the line. You're already a dead man. I didn't want to see this, exclaimed Mimi Heiji in frustration. If you had fought me any other way, you would have lived. I would have ensured it. So why? Why did you stubbornly use the one method I can't save you from? Why did you have to choose to fight against me, Ichigo? Was throwing your life away worth it? For this empty battle that will only prolong the inevitable. It's not over yet, he simply said in response. Not yet. Not until my body breaks down entirely. Until your soul does, you mean? You haven't used your Zanpakuto once in this fight, Mimi Heiji muttered. You think I wouldn't notice? They are your most prominent weapon, and yet not once have you drawn them to fight me. They aren't even here with you. You wouldn't risk holding back and not using them to fight me. The only reason you have for not using them, is that you can no longer wield them. Am I wrong? Mimi Heiji wasn't. There had been many times during this battle that wielding his Zanpakuto would have given him more confidence. He knew his blades like the back of his hands. Their length, their weight, their strength, they were the weapons of his own soul. They were extensions of himself, and no weapon he had made in this fight even came close to giving him the same feeling of confidence when he fought. If he could have used them right now, he would have in a heartbeat. They would have made him unstoppable if he had been able to harness the power of magic itself through them like he had done with Lumen Histo Ire. A single swing from a sword could have very well decided everything. It's the perfect hiding spot, Mimi Heiji continued, a speck of hatred lighting up in the man's eyes as he stared not at him but at something he was sure Mimi Heiji imagined he was seeing in his place. From the start I had my suspicions. Holding the entirety of magic within your body and keeping it all safe would be impossible. But if you could hold it within something else. If you could hold within the soul, it's in a place face could not reach. The perfect hiding spot. And the perfect way to throw away any hopes of living past this battle. If I'm wrong, go ahead and tell me. Please, tell me if I'm wrong. Denying Mimi Hagi's words was meaningless. It would only be pointlessly lying about something he could no longer bluff about. Not when Mimi Heiji had already come to the correct conclusions by merely observing him. He had done exactly as Mimi Heiji assumed and had hidden magic in the one place he could hide it. At what point did you start having to hold the pieces together? At what point did the blade you once held fail you? The moment he had taken in magic though, all he had felt was pain. He had taken all of magic into his soul, packed it in as tightly as possible. And even then it hadn't been enough. His soul was simply too small to contain that much power. So he had forced it through anyway. And in the process caused it to shatter entirely. In what must have been a moment before death he had used the same power he had used just now to save himself from death, binding those shattering pieces of his soul so that he could still function. So he could still live for a while longer. But his soul was not complete anymore. It was not whole. Not once had he heard Zanjitsu's voice since he made this decision. Not once had his Edala's self spoken up since agreeing to this plan before they commenced with it. Neither could reach him anymore, and neither could the blades he once wielded. If he tried, he would only get shards. It was why he had locked Mavis away, kept her as far away from him as possible so she could not be dragged into this mess. He could still feel the sliver of a connection between them, the golden strand he envisioned clinging to hundreds of the shattered pieces of his soul and trying to maintain the link. If the connection had been any stronger, that bond might have easily dragged her into this mess and shattered her too. In a lot of ways he couldn't quite deny Mimi Hagi's words to him. He was foolish, undertaking a plan that had resulting in him losing all of his greatest strengths only to gain a temporary power, one he had no experience using and could only trust in the memories and knowledge that came with it to help guide him. But it had still been the only way. For even a chance of victory, he had to lose. This is too pitiful to even watch, Mimi Heiji said to him as he let magic burst to life in his palms, forming a pair of large daggers this time, each roughly the length of his shorter Zanpakuto blade. It gave him only a fragment of familiarity but it was comforting nonetheless, a feeling he allowed to fill him before he focused on the magic gathering and held within the daggers themselves. You plan to still fight. I risked everything for this, didn't I? So I need to make it worth it. Mimi-Heiji could only shake his head at his words. Then you will only find despair at your end. I only need to wait now. It will soon be over, and I will no longer need to raise a hand against you to do that. Soon you shall die, ripped apart by the very thing you tried to save. And I will win, like I always would. Only to lose a dear friend in the process. Protector of the fairies. He can't win. Kisuk sighed, wishing he could pretend like this words weren't the truth before his eyes currently. He wanted to believe so badly that what Ichigo was doing would be enough. That he could actually beat Mimi-Heiji and save them all. But the reality presented before them was different, though judging by the looks he got from Levi and Laxus he doubted they yet understood. Just look, he uttered as he did his best to try and explain. Tell me what you see. Well. He waited as the two were left to try and track the fight currently going on, clashes of magic and magical barrier particles disrupting their field of view more times than was convenient for them right now. In the end their answers were as he expected. They're even right. I'd say so, agreed Laxus. Mimi-Heiji isn't really gaining any ground, but then neither is Ichigo. And from what I can tell, I don't think either of them are holding back here either. They're going in with everything they've got. At this point it would be foolish for either to do so, Levi pointed out. Their previous clashes show that. One wrong move and they will die. If they hold back even a bit it could be fatal. Kisuk nodded at their observations. All correct. However they missed too much. But you haven't taken into account certain factors. Look at the fight. Look how Mimi-Heiji only retaliates in a certain way. Look how he commits himself to attacks that don't involve him risking himself too much. There's no denying he's fighting seriously. But he's not fighting to win right now. He's not taking risks for a victory he knows he will eventually achieve if he continues fighting the way he is currently. Especially after what he just saw from Ichigo. When he almost self-destructed, right? Asked Levi. I didn't think that was something Mimi-Heiji did, unless the sheer presence of magical barrier particles caused an intense rejection to his very existence. Considering he recovered, though, I'm fairly confident it was a result of his own actions. That was certainly not a result of Mimi-Heiji, Kisuk confirmed. Too internal, and from what I could see it even looked like Mimi-Heiji was briefly surprised by the sight. This is the result of Ichigo taking all the power he has right now, the extreme, and then reaching his limit. What we witnessed a moment ago was his death. His death. Laxus scoffed. Then what do you call this right now? He's still fighting. He probably just lost control of his power for a bit and had to get it back under wraps. Except now Mimi-Heiji is allowing this fight to be dragged out. He's not pressing nearly as much as he was before, focusing on staying on the defensive. If Ichigo had merely slipped up, he'd be instead trying to cause him to do it again. But he's not, because he doesn't need to. Ichigo just died then, not from anything Mimi-Heiji did but because he simply reached his own limit. But he's alive. He's right there, still fighting. I know, muttered Kisuk. What he's just done is impossible. At least by any of us. But if he has the entirety of magic at this disposal. There have been many times where magic has caused miracles. Would it be so hard for him to bring them about? Assuming that's the case, why is there an issue? Levi asked. Unless, he can't do this indefinitely, can he? I'm not sure. But considering Mimi-Heiji isn't pressing as hard, he seems to believe so. He's focusing on keeping the status quo going because he believes if he does, he will win. Ichigo will self-destruct all by himself given enough time. What's simply stopping him from doing this indefinitely though? Asked Laxus. Can't he just keep doing the same thing again to prevent that? Perhaps Mimi-Heiji is merely awaiting an opening and wants to act faster this time. He's keeping too much distance for that, Kisuk replied, though he couldn't deny that the thought had crossed his mind. He might have kept the thought in consideration too, if not for the source of suspicions. Assuming Mimi-Heiji can just wait this battle out, why would Ichigo self-destruction? What is stopping him from performing the same miracle over and over again whenever he reaches his limit? From what we can see on the surface, nothing. Permanent damage doesn't even appear to be a thing for Ichigo currently. He lost his heart and didn't bat an eye. So what makes this different? physically the same work is being done. But if the damage was being done elsewhere? His soul, muttered Laxus in horror. Kisuk didn't need to look to know both of Ichigo's friends had a look of dread on their face. It was one he was sure he had briefly shown when he had first considered the possibility. There wasn't a single bit of magic that Ichigo possessed that wasn't linked to his soul in some way. Even Mavis and her power of Lumen Histoire was able to be linked tightly to him thanks to the connection made in his soul. His Shinigami, Hollow, and Quincy powers needed little explanation either. All his powers drew from his soul to some degree. But there was a single power amongst all of them, a subset of his Quincy powers, which allowed the reverse to occur. Enhanced by Waiwaka's power or not, Ichigo had possessed the innate ability through his Quincy magic to draw all manner of things into and out of his soul. It was what let Mavis latch herself onto him when she lacked her lacrima to be bound to. It was what allowed him to take the memories of enemies and read them like a book. It was what had once even allowed him to absorb attacks, something that he had avoiding doing when he could since Waiwaka's part of that power was taken. And it was the power that had allowed him to hide the Hujioka within his soul for years, unaware entirely of its presence until the day he had asked for it back. The Hujioka itself was not a simple existence. It let him overcome many barriers, but in all his years he had yet to fully understand everything about the object he had constructed. He knew it was far beyond the realms of normal magical items however, and Ichigo had held it in his soul with little consequence for dozens of years. It was only after Mavis appeared and joined that space, along with Ichigo's Edala's self, did Ichigo start to have issues maintaining his full power for long periods of time. He had said he had a time frame, one he couldn't go over. And he'd seen what happened when he did. Nozomi had barely managed to save him before they both returned. Which meant that for all that power might be capable of doing, it had a limitation to it. Storage. Most things didn't even interfere with that limit, but it existed. Laxus had already mentioned to him earlier about Mavis's presence, her physical presence, which meant that if she was now attached to her body there would be even less strain on Ichigo's soul. A connection was much easier to handle than letting an entity latch onto it like a Zanpakuta spirit. But even with two major strains on the soul gone, they had been replaced by another. A far greater one. How complex was the existence of magic in such a case? Could it even be described in a way they could understand? The only reasonable way Ichigo could have kept magic safe would have been to absorb it into his own soul, to place it somewhere it could survive the fallout. But magic was vast. The sheer power Ichigo was throwing around would still only be a drop in its full depths. By taking the full essence of magic into his soul, he was essentially its avatar. And yet that power had still torn him apart just then. "It's a physical effect," he muttered. "And I may be wrong. I hope I'm wrong. But I think the damage may be within his soul. And if it's in there, he can't repair it." Laxus demanded as he turned towards him for answers. "What's the difference whether if the damage is physical or spiritual? He has all of magic to fix himself up." "I know," Kisuk muttered gravely. "But with what he took into his soul, it's possible he died in that moment. That his soul shattered under the strain of trying to hold the full weight of magic within it. What we are witnessing right now is the echo from that moment. I don't think what he did to save himself a few moments ago was a miracle. I think what we are witnessing currently is the miracle, the power of magic being used to take those shattered shards and keep them in place, holding off the inevitable destruction for as long as possible. And when he saved himself a moment ago, that must have been when he was about to hit a limit and something within him snapped out of place. But it's back in place surely. Have you ever broken a vase?" Kisuk asked, ignoring the confused looks he got. "It's a similar situation here. The vessel shattered but you can always put it back together. Add some glue, weld pieces back in place if you wish, you can always return it to a usable state. But now there is a crack to it. It's weaker than before, never the same. It's not as strong as it once was. That's what I think is happening here. Even though Ichigo saved himself, he won't be able to do that forever. Every time he hits his limit again, he's forcefully trying to hold himself together. But that moment still damaged him further, making the end result more brittle. Eventually whatever trick he uses to keep himself alive won't be enough because his soul will no longer be able to be held together, and when that happens magic will be released. Mimi Hagi's waiting for that moment, Levi muttered in horror. So that's why you think he's drawing this out now. Because if he simply waits, Ichigo won't be able to keep himself together. Exactly. It's why unless Ichigo does something soon, Mimi Hagi's victory is all but assured. Protector of the Fairies. Stabbing forward, the single dagger he now held extended forth at blinding speeds, the corrosive poison that coated its blade getting flung around him as he swung it down. Every drop that hit the ground caused the earth to bubble and melt, but not a single bit came close to Mimi Hagi, impacting against an endless array of shields of magical barrier particles that could be formed at a moment's notice. Letting a growl out in annoyance, he swung his other fist forward, the dagger that had previously been there destroyed in the first clash, and unleashed a torrent of lightning to slam against the barriers that blocked his path. They shattered with ease, but their mere numbers made them a nuisance. This was Mimi Hagi's game currently. Cat and mouse, dragged out for as long as possible. If he unleashed a large-scale attack, the barriers Mimi Hagi brought out decreased drastically but skyrocketed in strength. If he swung out with attacks like he was doing at the moment, the barriers were uncountable, their purpose merely to block the poison being thrown and to cause any attacks he fired to be caught early. No matter what he did, the response was the same. He had first hoped that he could use that to trick Mimi Hagi, to take advantage of the man's arrogance. But it wasn't merely arrogance right now. Mimi Hagi didn't believe for a moment he would lose, but the man was smart enough to also realize that the outcome would change if he let his guard down. So long as Mimi Hagi remained alert, kept doing what he was doing, victory would come to him. That mindset though was a good thing. He was being pressured only when he attacked, being given far more leeway than he should have been when he paused. They were chances Mimi Hagi could have acted in to make a claim for victory, but currently presented unnecessary risk for something that was already certain. Mimi Hagi wasn't making the moves to stop him like before or challenge him in the same ways, and that left him unaware of what he was trying. He was sure Mimi Hagi was starting to notice at least. But did the man care? Did he think he could simply stop it anyway? He clung onto his thoughts himself, hoping they were what Mimi Hagi believed. He needed more time to set this up, more time to finish preparation, and more time to pain. It grew to unbearable heights once more, metal beginning to break through his back when he immediately snapped the fingers of his left hand to set his body back at ease. It had only been for a moment, but neither he nor Mimi Hagi had missed that. The look he was getting told him exactly what Mimi Hagi was confirming currently. The gap between these episodes was getting shorter. How much time did he still have? 5 minutes? 10. The more frequently he had to pull himself back together, the harder it would be to expend the energy necessary to fight. Eventually it would take all he would have just to stave off death, and if that happened before he could defeat Mimi Hagi, then this would all be for nothing. He needed to end this while he still could, but with how Mimi Hagi was acting right now, he knew he would only get one shot at this. There was only one way he knew for certain that would pull the table from underneath him. Lightly hitting the ground as he began to circle Mimi Hagi, he allowed his hand to momentarily touch the ground and push a trail of magic down into it. The rest he could control remotely, but he needed more of these anchor points and he needed to give them time to finish his calculations. He had felt slightly bad when he had latched onto Hibiki's super archive system and booted him off, but he needed all the processing power it could give him right now. Even as he continued to move, there was a calculation still in process, getting all the data he needed to ensure he didn't mess up the one chance he'd get. Quickly switching directions, he changed his path to charge towards Mimi Hagi, manipulating the dagger's size as he threw so that it quickly reached the size of a small house. It provided the perfect cover for him as he leapt against its surface, the poison still coating the blade doing nothing to him, and quickly ran along the side of the blade to hide where he was going to approach from. As he prepared to take a step near the edge though, the blade shattered before he could take that final step, one of many tendrils breaking through the blade and twisting round to restrain him in their clutches. Quickly spinning in retaliation, a stream of flames erupted from his hands to burn the darkness to a crisp. The damage was already done though. Mimi Hagi knew where he was, so he wasted no more time and just leapt over the edge of the dagger and kicked off with all his strength. His efforts rewarded him with a front row seat to a massive barrier, leaving no easy way around nor time to stop. Instead he merely snapped his fingers, altering the skin of his body and spun, turning himself into a miniature battling drill to pierce straight through. It wasn't the correct decision. With how wide the wall had been, he hadn't had much way of realizing. It wasn't a wall before him but a cube, and as he tore through he was quickly plunged into darkness as the barrier behind him closed up. Immediately it felt like he was being crushed, the sheer concentration of magical barrier particles around him knocking him from the sky back to the ground, upon which they tried to keep him there as they attacked every last bit of magic being unleashed. And left in here for a minute or so, he was sure he'd die quite painfully. The rumbling of the ground too told him much, like how the cube was slowly compressing in further and forcing the magical barrier particles in the air to become even more concentrated as they struggled to be contained within. Pinning him to the ground like this was good. It made it hard to break out downwards when the ground was in the way, and he couldn't easily reach the other sides of this cube when he was having the energy he was emitting was being destroyed faster than he could release it. Add on the fact that his senses were blocked, any means to assist them being broken apart by the toxic environment he had fallen into, merely left one option. To increase the output of the magic he was emitting drastically, to the point that the mass concentration of magical barrier particles couldn't keep up. Cracks burst to life across his body as the light coming from him became blinding to any that might have been witnessing it, and immediately the darkness was torn away for an equally blinding sight. Magic lashed out at everything in its way, clearing out the air before slamming into the walls closing in on him. They're held, but only for a second or two. Afterwards they shattered and all the magic that had been packed within that small space erupted outwards, clearing away everything within the nearby vicinity. As his vision returned, he saw Mimi-Heiji watching him passively from a distance, a chipped barrier being moved as the magic that had been released became to be torn apart by the rest of the magical barrier particles in the air. He didn't bother fighting that, allowing the magic he was emitting to reduce to the level it was before. One of his wrists briefly twitched uncontrollably, pain building up, and he knew he had to act quickly. But before he did he first let himself fall to one knee, showing the pain he felt willingly to allow Mimi-Heiji to focus more on that than on what he was actually doing. His unharmed hand quickly brushed against the ground, injecting more magic deep into the earth and allowing it to grow fueled by the magic from within him to a state that it wouldn't be wiped out once he left it alone. And then he snapped his fingers, completing the illusion that he had only been acting out of pain from his body reaching its limit once again. Almost done. Just a bit more. The calculation needed just a bit more time but he still needed more anchor points. Could he drag this out longer? No. His body would surely fail if he tried that. That cube hadn't meant to hold him, it had meant to force him to break free through force. It was meant to force him to speed up his own destruction. If that was the case, he would have to throw away some subtly now. Let Mimi-Heiji make his own conclusions and act based on whatever response he got. Darting backwards, putting distance between the two of them much to Mimi-Hagi's surprise, he didn't bother hiding his actions any further as he allowed his hand to drag along the ground, leaving a trail of magic in his wake. Part of it quickly sunk into the ground but it was hidden by the large stretch of light that grew upwards in its place, twisting and bending until it formed a massive spear. He hoped Laxus wouldn't mind if he stole the form for his own spell here but its image was perfect for what he needed. Reaching out, he let his palm rest against the shaft of the giant construct, light sparking off into the air and towards the ground as it found itself filled with a greater supply of energy than before. Its form could only contain so much so it inevitably had to discharge the excess to its surroundings, which suited his goals perfectly. It was easy enough to hide the magic he needed to cast within the excess energy and have it transmit it to the ground when it stuck. From the look of Mimi-Heiji too, it appeared the man at least recognized the sizable threat facing him. And like always he found an identical copy of his own attack being formed, a perfect mirror in every way. Good. Even when trying to keep the status quo, Mimi-Heiji wasn't immune from being provoked like this. The size of the weapons probably helped, giving Mimi-Heiji plenty of distance between the two of them. The longer Mimi-Heiji could keep that mindset, the better. Darting forward, they both ended up clashing as their spears slammed against one another. Neither could gain any ground and they found themselves being repelled back, but that was fine. More energy was expelled from his construct that could fall to the ground as they darted across the battlefield. Like before, he was constantly having to chase Mimi-Heiji down, having to force the clash between the two of them. He could even feel the pull of stagnation on his body, slowing him down when he did get close, but with Mimiheiji not committing to any attack he had little to fear from sudden retaliation. Pain briefly overtook him during one of their clashes, causing him to have a good chunk of his side taken out when he momentarily lost focus from the pain. A snap of his fingers restored most of him back to normal, but the wound itself took slightly longer. The smirk from Mimiheiji was the worst part though. The gaps were getting shorter and shorter. He needed to hurry this up. Pushing off the air to increase his speed, he shot down at Mimiheiji and thrust the spear forward. Mimiheiji retaliated perfectly, and it should have resulted in another draw. That was until he allowed his own construct to shatter on contact, the magic raining down all around them as he continued to close the gap. Energy reshaped in his other hand, a smaller but equally deadly version of the spear forming, and as fast as he could he flung it forward with all his might. It missed, Mimiheiji avoiding the blow by a hair's breadth. His arrogant look never dimmed once, and that face was all he saw for a moment before he was slammed straight into towards the ground from a mass of magical barrier particles from above. Hitting the ground, he let out a brief groan as he began to push himself to his feet. His senses were going crazy, meaning something was up, and as he stared back up he met the sight of a night sky, not a single light in that darkness. He quickly snapped his fingers before swearing. Nope, it hadn't just turned to night. That was simply a mass of magical barrier particles so dense it blocked out the sky itself. He couldn't even see Mimiheiji in that mess, but he knew this was meant to wear him out further. And he didn't so much see it but sense it as that great mass of magical barrier particles began to fall. If he acted now, blocking this was easy. So easy that he would hardly have to strain himself. This might have been a dense mass, but he had broken through similar densities before. But this was too widespread. It would crush every single barrier he had placed in the nearby vicinity, and that was likely its intention too. Mimiheiji was taking advantage of his nature to protect, knowing he would pick the option to save them even if it hastened his own demise. Well, he wasn't wrong. Right now that was the only choice he could see. Abandoning them wasn't an option. But first he needed time. With a snap of his fingers the ground sunk, bringing the barriers down with him as he tried to buy as much time as he could. With another snap he conjured the start of the barrier itself, projecting it up so that it would cover the area he needed to keep safe. Now came the hard part. The existing barriers would break under the pressure of that much magical barrier particles. They were only meant to stop the passive attacks from the current world, not stop an all-out assault from Mimiheiji himself. They needed to be stronger. Tougher. And that required magic, and a lot of it. Cracks reappeared across his skin as he pushed his body to its limits. Light burst out in every direction, but he stopped it from escaping too far, wrapping it tightly around himself and projecting it upwards towards the growing barrier. With each passing moment it widened and thickened, increasing the chance of survival. But it still wasn't going to be enough at this rate. Not if he was alone. He needed help. So he brought help. With a snap of his fingers, there was two of him. With the sound of two more snaps, simultaneously ringing out, there was four of him. Then 8 as more rang out, followed by 16, 32, and 64. The lot around him all scattered quickly, crossing the landscape and coming to a stop at various distances away. And each, like he was doing already, raised a hand up and added energy of their own to the barrier. It wasn't easy though. With over 60 entities now acting independently to him, all feeding off the magic that was housed within their shared soul, they could complete this. The barrier was growing exponentially faster, the darkness from above slamming into it and coming to a halt as the two energies fought for dominance. Either the barrier would crack, or the magical barrier particles being used in the assault would run out. Victory would be clearly decided either way. The problem was the time. He quickly found himself snapping his fingers every few seconds. Increasing the number of versions of himself had solved the issue of output. Each copy of himself could reach their own limit and had increased the amount of magic being thrown about tremendously. But at the same time that meant he was going over his limit by over 60 times its usual amount. There was only so much his soul could take when it had to try and work with the magic within under such intense pressure. He had to hold out. The energy would fade soon. The barrier just had to hold out until then. Just a few moments more, then he could let up for a few moments. He just needed it to end. Except it didn't. He found himself waiting and waiting, the darkness pressing down upon the barrier never seeming to stop. With every passing second he found that even these best efforts were starting to fail, the golden energy that held back the darkness dimming and showing signs of cracking. And eventually it began to fail. A piece of the barrier broke and magical barrier particles rained through the gap, slamming against the landscape like a wave reaching the shore. As more tried to break through, the cracks could only widen, and as he tried to stop its flow, another part of the barrier shattered. Bit by bit, the barrier was failing. But he couldn't simply retreat right now. Failure wasn't an option. So despite the dangers he knew this posed, he doubled the number of versions of himself again as 64 snaps rang out at once, following by a rapid series of single snaps from the original source. 128. This time it was enough. Some of the new copies of him lent their strength to the barrier while others crushed the gaps and did damage control. And then, with the lot of them all working together, they pushed back against the falling darkness until finally the sky began to become clear. It started as a dot, barely noticed by one of his copies. And then it multiplied, appearing in various areas above them as the magical barrier particles began to be thinned out. As the constant wave of them finally reached a limit, and those gaps only widened as the rest of the magical barrier particles slammed against the barrier. Bit by bit they could see the sky once more, until finally it was perfectly clear above them. He dropped the barrier immediately, falling to his knees as he kept up the repeated pattern of snapping his fingers. Metal continued to jump back and forth out of his arm, constantly reaching a point where it almost crippled him before being pulled back in only to have the process start again from scratch. Half his copies immediately vanished and he found himself able to slow down, more copies vanishing once again and again until only he remained once more. But even then he could feel the pain quickly catching up with him, another episode hitting him as he made to snap his fingers once more to stop the agony from growing worse and consuming him. It happened at that moment. Right in between his brief scream and the moment that he was to snap his fingers, everything crawled to a halt. Even his voice was briefly silenced, his body frozen in space as another closed the distance between them in the time it would have taken one to blink from their perspective. And by the time Ichigo was able to snap his fingers, a familiar blade sticking through his chest. "I trust you remember this blade," Mimi Heiji said. "Though not like this, I reckon. Tsujiya no Kotori, the Shikai of Juushiros, and my Zanpakuto. It's quite the weapon, I must say. It's even able to channel my magical barrier particles through it, despite once being a conduct for magic. A result of the long bond between myself and Juushiro, I reckon." Raising the other blade, an identical copy of the first linked together by rope and metal charms, Mimi Heiji prepared to bring it down before another snap was heard, quickly choosing to withdraw instead as lightning burst down towards him while tearing the first blade back out of Ichigo's body. Another snap had the energy redirect its course, but that gave Mimi Heiji enough time to bring one of his blades forward, the energy colliding with the tip and vanishing within. The other blade snapped up and immediately a twisted version of the same lightning was unleashed, its old fuel of magic gone and replaced with magical barrier particles. Another snap was heard and it was torn apart by a shockwave of magic before one final snap was heard, the action merely to relieve the pain Ichigo found himself feeling, being unable to bear once again. "You like to play dirty, don't you?" he muttered, knowing what Mimi Heiji had done to close the gap on him so quickly. In the space between pain overtaking him and his fingers being able to snap, Mimi Heiji had hit him with his power of stagnation. In a state where he could do nothing but try and get rid of the pain before it torn him apart, Mimi Hagi's stagnation had nothing to resist its power. He had been frozen in that moment, or rather slowed down to such a degree that he hadn't been able to resist until his fingers finally were able to snap. "And yet you still didn't take the risk and try to take my head." "I'm no fool," Mimi Heiji replied calmly. "There's no guarantee that taking your head will kill you currently. Snapping your fingers is the trigger for magic to act." "Nonsense. That's only a tool you are using to visualize. If I tear your head off, you'll merely find another trigger to use in that brief moment, or even allow magic to run free entirely to restore yourself back to normal. Better to constantly wear you down, force you to expend more and more of your strength, until finally you break into a million pieces." Still, Mimi Heiji added, having noticed how frequently he was snapping his fingers currently, "I have to say it worked far better than I anticipated." I had a feeling that my little stunt wouldn't be enough, and it certainly wouldn't have been if you had chosen to forsake those around you. If you had left them to die, you could have fought me for some time more. However, instead you chose to break past your own body's limit so many times. You've cut your limited lifespan down to almost nothing, and I've hardly had to do anything to cause this. You still think you've won? Mimi Heiji sighed at his words before mockingly tilting his head. Huh? Whatever do you mean? From the beginning you haven't been worried about losing. This might not have gone exactly as you planned, but you haven't believed you would ever lose. Of course not, stated Mimi Heiji with certainty. You think I wasted my time these long years? I prepared everything for this day. My ultimate plan, the kami cake, was for this eventual day. Years in the making, the result of careful planning and execution, predicting the outcomes of hundreds of events based on the experience I had obtained over observing this world for so long in exile, all to finally achieve my goal. You think I left anything up to chance? That I left any possibility that I could lose? Your presence isn't a spanner here. It's just pushed the end result back a bit. Perhaps that's correct in your mind, he replied calmly, making sure to keep a check on how much time he had left for the spell he needed to be prepared. Perhaps there is no changing this. But why did you even take the chance? What are you? Have you gone mad? Mimi Heiji asked, for once appearing to be lost for words. I didn't take any chances. Did you not? That's interesting then. Because why was I even able to reach this state? That surely must have been an unacceptable risk. Or better yet, why did you even allow me enough time to reunite with Mavis to obtain the power of Lumen Histo-Ire? That's because... Mimi Hagi's words trailed off, the man himself looking like he wasn't quite sure of his answer. It's because... Because something inside you said not yet, right? I wasn't sure at first, he admitted. I had doubts. But there was something nagging on my mind. Why now? Why did you only activate Face today? Silence met him in response. It didn't surprise him. He doubted Mimi Heiji had considered why it had to be today that Face was activated. Perhaps the man had simply attributed it to the fact that Face was activated on this day in the previous timeline, but it still left a question remaining. Why this day in general? Why this day out of all others? Thanks to Juoshiro's position, you could construct Face at a rate you probably hadn't ever been capable of before. You had resources, you had help, and you could easily clear away those that were unnecessary once you were done. Mest was useful because you could ensure his memories remained sealed while ensuring you had a useful tool to help facilitate the construction of your secret weapons. But you lost that power once you retired. Part of me questions even why you did retire, but by that point you surely didn't have much work left to do. But there was still finishing touches that needed to be done, I assume, and so you vanished for 7 years. The next time anyone saw you, it was when you met me at the headquarters of the Magic Council, he added, pressing on and hoping he could keep buying for this last bit of time. Another snap of his fingers told him he wouldn't get many more if he failed after all this. And right after that you got made a chief member of the Fiori War Council. This wasn't a job you could easily vanish at times though, and nor was the war helpful for any construction of new face devices. Peacetime hide at best, but when the whole country is alert you could never maintain secrecy. But then you didn't need to make any more. Your plan was already complete. So why not last week? He asked. Why did it have to today? Why not have it begin much earlier in the war? Well protected behind a barrier, no one would have been able to stop you in time, and it's not like Fairy Sphere was capable of containing the blast. It didn't even cover them all in the first place. You could have activated Face when Alvarez was halfway across the sea towards us. No, even before then. Why didn't you just activate Face the moment you finished the final device? Letting his eyes glance to one side, in the direction where he knew Ziref was in, he asked, was it because of him? Because you wanted to kill Ziref personally? If so, why didn't you do it at the Magic Council? You could have had it triggered at the right moment and killed him then. Or did you need an audience? Because if that was the case, why didn't you pull it off when Ziref was near the barrier? You have had opportunities. Countless, I'd say. And yet you only activated face today. But there's something that bothers me the most, he added, a brief memory coming to mind from when he raided the secret room within the Magic Council. Your plan, the Kami cake. Why did you tell me its name? Its name. When did I? The letter. Ah yes, I remember that. Why did I? Why did Juoshiro? You don't get it, do you? He muttered, snapping his fingers once more. You knew Juoshiro could influence you. You've acknowledged that, especially when it comes to me. But despite all of that, you thought you understood what was being influenced. You assumed you were still in control, all of the time. That it merely influenced your daily life. Because the idea Juoshiro could influence something as important as your master plan, the very object you had been desiring to fulfill for so many eons. Well, how on earth could a mere human ever stop you? No, that's not possible. I would have known dash. There was no need to alert me of the plan, he stated. It was a word that made no sense to me, so naturally I looked it up. And I found nothing about it, not even in the Holy Palace. It was a word not recorded by magic. It was like a beacon telling me to notice this, but even with that I was blind for some time. I didn't realize how big of a threat you posed until things steadily got worse. And you know what's even odder? In the timeline before all of this, the timeline that the mest I know came from, it's over 7 years ahead of us. And you had yet to activate face. 7 years. Mimi-Heiji shook his head. No, why would I wait so long? That's impossible. There would be no reason to. Unless you were convinced there was. If there was a voice telling you constantly to wait. Today isn't the right day, now isn't the right time, the moment isn't here yet. They don't need to be much, just mere thoughts to cast doubt in your mind. To make you hesitate, even for a bit longer. And it worked. It might have worked for even longer in this timeline, if not for the events that presented themselves. Primarily the fact I doubt Zeref ever exposed himself this much, in a weakened state you simply could not resist. And once it happened once, the knowledge you gained from that future self of yours convinced you today was the day you had to do it no matter what, as you were determined to keep your victory in place. But in doing so allowed me time to find a solution to fight against you. Which brings us to this situation right now, he added finally. You still don't want to kill me, even though I wield the thing you hate the most. I'm not just using magic right now, I am it. There should be nothing you hate more in this world than me, and yet you still wish I wasn't dying. You claimed that was the will of both of you. That your will was influenced by Juoshiro's on this. But how much of that is you desiring to not kill me? And how much of it belongs to Juoshiro getting in your way? Mimi-Heiji remained silent at his words, staying that way for so long that he wasn't even sure if the man was listening any further. Only the sound of snapping broke the air between the two of them, a sound that only seemed to grow louder the longer Mimi-Heiji remained silent like this. I've changed my mind, came the words that finally broke the silence, Mimi-Heiji letting out a dry laugh as his grip noticeably tightened on his blade. I was willing to allow you to cast that spell you've been preparing. I was willing to let it be your final act, one I would crush to end the legacy of magic once and for all. But now, as Ichigo went to snap once again, everything came to a halt. Mimi-Heiji didn't bother to run, instead calmly walking the distance between the two of them and raising his sword. From above, all the magical barrier particles in the nearby vicinity were drawn into the tip of the blade, gathering within until the blade's color changed to a deep black. Instead, I'll finish this now. Bringing his other blade up, he pointed it directly at Ichigo's head, the point of the blade resting between his eyes. Goodbye, Ichigo. You never answered my question. Mimi-Hagi's eyes widened as Ichigo suddenly moved, his attack firing a second too slow. It still scrapped along the side of Ichigo's head, tearing away flesh and exposing bone beneath, but it had meant to end the fight entirely. And Ichigo wasn't going to complain about a little injury that was already being forcefully repaired. Waiting had been the hardest part just then. But Mimi-Heiji had been right about something in his beliefs. This body was like a puppet's, one even he could control. So all he had to do was take a step back, to leave it standing there motionless and waiting for the command it needed. It might not have worked if Mimi-Heiji hadn't been riled up. It might not have worked if Mimi-Heiji hadn't expected to see him frozen there at the moment he timed his use of his stagnation power. But it had worked, and before Mimi-Heiji could escape, his left hand shot out and wrapped itself around Mimi-Hagi's wrist, twisting it so that the sword was aimed away from him. His other hand shot forward, covered in so many cracks that it was quickly engulfed in the light that it was releasing. What few magical barrier particles that rose to stop it were quickly destroyed without even slowing his hand down until it found its target. "So if you won't answer me," he muttered, gripping onto Mimi-Hagi's face as the light burst forward and caused the man before him to scream, "then why don't we ask the man himself?" And with that, he pulled and pushed. Towards him came one, and as his right hand pushed away it found itself phasing through flesh and blood, continuing to press against something else that was there as one became two. Pain was building, but he ignored it, doing his best to try and hold out even as metal started to tear out from his back. And with one loud scream, he finished the job and snapped his fingers. And as his body repaired itself, another snap sounded and light engulfed the area. For once the scream heard wasn't his. Protector of the Fairies. Check the description for the links to the author.